G'day, mate. 40 here. So DEI kills, like dishonesty on a national, public, political, social, cultural reality basis kills, and not recognizing that different groups have different gifts and that many of these gifts have some genetic component. You're just denying reality. And to push our military to admit women, to push our law enforcement agencies, to push any business or any agency to accept women or Jews or blacks or any group that you name, right, not in proportion to their merit, is just calling for disaster. And this is the New York Times. Long story from Sunday. Missteps, equipment problems, and a common but risky practice led to a fatal crash. And it was just super complicated. That's what the New York Times wants us to know about that helicopter flying into the path of a passenger jet, right? So here's the New York Times. New details revealed by the Times show that the failures on January 29 before an Army helicopter crashed into a jet. Every time I see that, it looks like a deliberate terror, murderous assault by this female captain, Captain Lobach, crashed into a jet near Reagan National Airport. But the reasons, Guy, the failures, they're far more complex than previously known. Right? That's a lie. The reason for this crash is one person. It is the helicopter pilot who either deliberately or just by massive levels of incompetence caused this crash that took 67 lives. Here's a good liberal, Jimmy Dore.
Crashed into that American Airlines jet in D.C. And remember, they wouldn't release the name of the pilot, and they until they could scrub. Well, it turns out the pilot was a woman, and it was where this is going. 100% pilot error. And Trump was saying, and Trump came out immediately and connected it with DEI, and the New York Times just wrote a story about it and talk about burying the lead. Well, it turns out, you want to see what they did? Alex Berenson caught this. He goes, the New York Times story on the January D.C. plane crash hides its takeaway until the last sentences. The takeaway, meaning the most important part of the show, about the story, they buried until the last. I wonder why they did that. The lady helicopter pilot ignored multiple warnings from her right seat about altitude, as he was directly telling her to turn away. So there was a male who was her instructor.
Stop.
And he was telling her what to do, and she kept ignoring his direction.
Oh.
And she flew straight into a passenger jet. You want to? By the way, I think the guys at the New York Times misunderstood their instructions. That a good reporter is supposed to do a lot of digging, but it's not supposed to be so you bury the story like a gangster in the Meadowlands. But that's what they did. Here's the headline: Missteps, equipment problems, and common but risky practice led to a fatal crash.
What was the practice? The
new details revealed by the Times show complex failures. Turns out it wasn't complex.
Did you have a dick? Maybe it is.
It was the pilot not listening to instructions.
Because he was mansplaining?
I guess he was mansplaining.
I thank God that the pilot wasn't Chinese, or else this would be racist as well as sexist, this story.
By the way, believe me, this is brought to you by the same people who told you the rise of heart problems after the vaccine was due to late night television watching.
Women told me that.
Women told me that, yeah.
Women said that.
So here's from the end of the article. The Black Hawk was 15 seconds away from crossing paths with a jet. The warrant officer, Eves, then turned his attention to Captain Lobach. That's the pilot. He told her he believed that the air traffic control wanted them to turn left toward the East River Bank. Turning left would have opened up more space between the helicopter and the American Airlines Flight 5342, which was heading for runway 33 at the altitude of 300 feet. She did not turn left. Yes, there were other factors that allowed her to screw up and kill herself and almost 70 other people, but she was the one flying the Black Hawk, and she repeatedly ignored warnings. Of course, this is going to empower all the dumb guys who are saying, see, chicks just don't listen. But
well, Jimmy, I have questions. Has the coroner's report come back as to whether she was on her pyramid or not?
Shut up. The FAA mandated an altitude of no higher than 300 feet for that part of the route, meaning that an altitude of 400 feet would have been unacceptable and could have positioned the Black Hawk uncomfortably close to the departing and landing.
And it wasn't just this one brief error that she made. She was consistently flying in an incredibly reckless manner.
Airplanes. By 8:44 p.m., it seemed to be in more of an appropriate spot. As the helicopter approached the Key Bridge, from which it would fly south along the river, Warrant Officer Eves stated that it was at 300 feet and descending to 200 feet. Necessary because the maximum height for this route closer to the airport is supposed to be 200 feet. So they were at 300 feet, which is where the jet was. They were supposed to be at 200. But even as it reached the juncture...
Look, it doesn't even matter that much whether or not this was an intentional act of murder by the captain, right? It's important, but when you reach a certain level of negligence, when you intentionally engage in such reckless disregard for safety, then you're effectively guilty of murder. And I'll give you an analogy. In libel in the United States, in the context of libel, reckless disregard for the truth. That's what will get you a guilty civil plea, a guilty verdict in libel. If I've been writing on my blog, I've been in journalism since high school, so I've always known what it means to operate with reckless disregard for the truth. So if it's with a public figure operating with reckless disregard for the truth, it doesn't really have anything to do with your feelings. All right, this isn't about feels. It's about if you are putting forward statements without operating with due diligence with regard to the truth of them. Whatever your feelings, it doesn't really matter. Whatever your intentions, it doesn't really matter. If you're just so reckless with the truth, right? If you fail to adequately investigate the story, if you rely on unreliable sources, if you have a motive to publish the statement regardless of its truth, if you ignore facts that would have revealed the statement's falsity, right, you can be found guilty of reckless disregard for the truth. You can be found guilty of libel, right? So reckless disregard means that you either had serious doubts about the statement's truth or you didn't care about the truth or the chances of truth in the statement. So it's not necessarily your specific feelings. It's if you're publishing with reckless disregard for the truth, right, you are vulnerable to being found guilty in a libel suit. This woman operated with reckless disregard for the truth, reckless disregard for safety for other people. And so it was so reckless that in holding her accountable and for people who promoted this type of policy, right, with reckless disregard for public safety, they're effectively guilty of mass murder because it was just so negligent.
Warrant Officer Eves evidently felt obligated to repeat his instruction. Hey, we're at 300 feet. You're supposed to be at 200. So he's telling her to turn left. He's telling her to get down to 200 feet. And you need to descend. Captain Lobach said she would. But 2.5 minutes later, the Black Hawk was still above 200 feet, a dangerously high level. So this is 100% pilot error.
It's kind of bizarre, actually. How often does this happen when someone just doesn't? I mean, if any care of a pilot, like, okay, I will, then they just don't do it. Does that happen a lot? I don't think it does it?
You wouldn't think. Here's Gary Weiss says, true, the details are at the end of the story, but it is alluded to 11 paragraphs down into the article. They allude to the real reason the plane crashed, but it's 11 paragraphs in. Clearly, the cause of the crash was pilot error, and only pilot error. They buried the lead. Of course they did. Well, here's what he says. Not only the helicopter crew appeared to have made more than one mistake. Not only was the Black Hawk flying too high, but in the final seconds before the crash, its pilot failed to heed a directive from her co-pilot, an Army flight instructor to change course. So let's just go. I got one more. Remember when the story broke? This is from SEO for Deplorables. Says, remember when the story broke? They initially withheld the female pilot's name at the request of her family, which was highly unusual for accidents like this. Yes, it was. When they finally released her name, they called her the third soldier inside the Black Hawk helicopter. They didn't call her the pilot. Isn't this weird?
Wait a minute. What? She was piloting it? You know, I just saw a fake space launch where some chicks were just in like a bouncy castle, basically. They called them astronauts. But now she's the third.
Now she's the third. So number two, it was not until today, 3 months later, that I'm even hearing she was the pilot.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
I believe Captain Lobach's service and sacrifice should be honored. She was the pilot. I also believe that any media outlet that chooses to attack Pete Hegseth for even questioning the role of DEI on overall safety is committing malpractice and endangering the lives of more civilians and service members. Well, let's look at this. So here's how they Newsweek. Who was Rebecca Lobach, the third soldier named in DC Blackhawk crash? Who was Captain Rebecca Lobach, the third soldier? Army identifies third soldier.
So there's been a ton of news media coverage of this crash, but almost none of it honestly taking on the matter of diversity, equity, inclusion, that she was promoted way above her abilities. And there's just a consistent news media blind spot with regard to this, because the attitude that you have to maintain if you want any kind of status in the Western world is that there are not group differences, that there are not genetic bases for group differences. You have to be silent in the face of a lie, or to actively promote the lie that the evidence isn't overwhelming, that different groups have different gifts, that different groups evolved in different circumstances, and there is therefore some genetic background for different groups evolving differently. I've been watching all these documentaries on Mount Everest, and Sherpas develop a particular ability to operate in high altitudes that people who aren't Sherpas don't have. Right? So if your ancestors lived in high altitudes for many, many, many generations, you likely have a superior ability to deal with high altitudes that other people don't. Africans often have a superior ability to deal with the challenge of certain diseases and certain climates that non-Africans do not have. Right? Different groups obviously have different gifts. Just watch sports. I'm watching the NBA playoffs. Look at the NBA playoffs. Tell me it's not bleedingly obvious that different groups do not have different gifts. And yet, as soon as you assent to this overwhelming truth, all right, you are drummed out of any position of status in society, with few exceptions. All right, it's just completely unacceptable if you wish to have a large position in society to simply recognize and assent to this bleeding obvious truth. And that which cannot be said out loud will increasingly not be thought out loud. And so if there is not a different groups have different gifts understanding of reality, then if the percentage of women, the percentage of blacks, the percentage of Jews, the percentage of Mexicans, the percentage of Asians doesn't meet your particular quota, then you're going to blame it on racism and some oppressive society, right? And you're just going to get all bollocksed up if you don't recognize these basic truths about life. Women have certain gifts that men don't have. Men have certain gifts that women don't have, right? Blacks have certain gifts that non-blacks don't have. White people, people of Northern European heritage, have certain gifts that people of Southern European heritage and Eastern European heritage do not have to the same degree. Northeast Asians have different gifts than people of South Asian ancestry. All right? The gifts of the Argentinians are different from the gifts of the Brazilians.
Yeah.
U.S. Army pilot Rebecca 20 identified as third soldier. What we know about North Carolina soldier who died in D.C. helicopter plane crash. And at the bottom, it says D.C. plane crash. Army identifies third soldier. Isn't that weird? So this is all seems very weird. It seems like they were afraid of a DEI narrative coming out. And so
soldier, she was working with the Biden White House. She wasn't doing much soldiering.
So they tried to bury the fact that it was a female pilot.
It sounds like Pat Tillman's story.
Yeah, of course.
Remember Pat Tillman? And then you're like, oh, it was just a waste of his life. And then, I mean, or the one chick they supposedly rescued, but then it came out, all this stuff. They do that all the time. This is military. So, of course.
Yeah.
And this is when Trump was coming in, right after he got in, I guess. And they got heat on him for their dumb DEI things in the military. Remember that commercial we laughed at?
Yes.
Oh, I laughed.
Right. We should not have women in combat roles. All right. There are certain gifts when men and women work together. There are also certain dangers. There are many advantages to having men-only groups or men-only workplaces or men-only schools and women-only groups and women-only jobs and women-only social settings and women-only clubs, all right? There are benefits and there are prices to be paid when you put men and women together. But then when you add DEI on top of that, all right, you have a recipe for chaos. We should not have women in combat. We should not have women flying helicopters, attack helicopters in the U.S. military in combat positions, right? It's just demoralizing for society. Just like we should have a heterosexual military. We should have certain institutions that uphold certain norms for the sake of group cohesion and group effectiveness, right? In a normal, healthy, free society, homosexuals are going to dominate certain areas of society, and heterosexuals should get to dominate other areas of society. Women should dominate some things. Men should dominate others. Jews will dominate some things. Blacks will dominate others. All right, we should just allow the different groups to flourish, and we should allow people, if they only want to hire black Muslims or white Jews or brown Mexicans or whatever their preference in the workplace, people should be allowed to hire and to surround themselves with whatever group they want to be. If blacks want to maintain their neighborhood, they should get to have a black neighborhood and get to organize in their own group interests. If Mexicans want to organize in their own group interests to maintain their dominance in certain institutions or certain neighborhoods, they should be allowed to do that. Say with Jews, say with white people, brown people, yellow people, any people you name. All right. And instead, we've got this insufferable civil rights industrial complex with the government intervening and scrutinizing and litigating the most intimate parts of our lives, and then lying about the obvious fact that these different groups have different gifts. Right. And one of the biggest lies that people buy into, it comes from a noble truth that there is an ideal to treating people as individuals. Right. There is something to be said for that. And it is a gift of the Anglo-Saxon perspective on life. But it's not how the world works. Right. The world works that we don't see people primarily as individuals, except for special cases where we get to know people. So for a tiny number of people, as we get to know them fairly well, then they become individuals to us. Otherwise, they are primarily Jews, Christians, Orthodox Jews, blacks, gays. That's how we understand people, as groups. And membership has its privileges, right? You're a member of an Orthodox synagogue. There are privileges and there are responsibilities that come with that. If you are an American citizen, there are particular privileges and responsibilities that come with that are not available to you if you are some foreign exchange student or even if you're a green card holder. Right? If you're an Australian citizen, there are certain privileges that are available to you. Let's say you're a dual Australian citizen and American citizen. Well, there are certain privileges available to you, but there are certain prices to be paid for that. So let's say you want to be in the American Armed Forces or the Australian Armed Forces or in some position of authority, either in the United States or Australia, right? If you maintain citizenship in some other country, right, you are going to be severely limited, right? You are going to be kept out of a lot of secrets. So wonderful to view people as individuals, right? That's a wonderful individualist strategy when you get to know people fairly well. And you recognize that there are many dimensions to this or that person, but it's not how we work overall, right? Overall, when we're driving down the street and someone's driving badly, we see them as black or Jewish or Asian or Mexican or white guy or whatever it is, all right? When we're interacting with people most of the time, we're not seeing people as individuals, right? We are part of a group, right? We grow up in tribes, in communities. And Donald Trump is shedding some light on this group membership nature of reality that the elites want to deny, the mainstream media wants to deny. The commentary
a weird place, because as I say, if Democrats, civil libertarians and others want to say that these are matters involving speech and that they are matters involving a proper administrative procedure and the rule of law, that is fine. The fact that it tips over into celebrations of Mohsen Mandawi's rhetoric and behavior and comportment, and that we're supposed to cry tears over Mahmoud Khalil's inability to be in the delivery room with his wife upon the birth of his child. Just like to point out that, my dad wasn't in the delivery room when I was born, because dads weren't in the delivery room in 1961. And somehow, women managed to get through deliveries. I was in the delivery room with my wife, but, this is not like a civil, this is the destruction of all family relationships and an act of totalitarian tyranny that a husband is not in the delivery room with his wife. Nonetheless, this the sentimentalization of these cases is could be a very serious slow acting poison.
It's not slow acting. It's instant. I mean, they're to Christine's point about what all these people are really up to. Imagine that after 9/11, campuses were overtaken with people here on visas, and they were echoing and promoting Al-Qaeda propaganda and bin Laden talking points. Would everyone be saying, "Oh, this is free speech. This is a free speech debate. This is a matter of free." No.
Right, free speech is a wonderful value, but sometimes there are more important things than free speech. And when it comes to foreigners, right, they are not entitled to the same free speech rights as American citizens. Green card holders are not entitled to the same free speech rights as citizens. Membership has its privileges. If you're not a member, right, you don't get the same privileges as members do. Right, Tennessee body cam of Maryland man, traffic stop shows troopers' hands tied despite smuggling clues. Tennessee Highway Patrol troopers called ICE during the encounter, which didn't come to pick up.
Hello, sir. How are you? Good, and you? All right. Anything good? You got a bunch of people in here, don't you? It's one for shit. Yes. Go back to work. Gotcha. Where are you working at? Where? Where? St. Louis, Missouri. Missouri? Yes, sir. Gotcha. Okay. But I'm from Maryland. Okay.
Maryland man.
Now, the reason I stopped you, we was running 75 down through here. 75? Yeah. Well, this is 65 through here. I know. I'm going to 70. Going 70? Yeah. What's the limit right now? Is 70 or 65? It's 65. Oh, I can see it, sir. You got all your info? I see the order, the speed limit. I see the... Yeah, it jumps up and down.
Okay. The Democrats, all right, the head of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives has told Democrats don't be making any more flights down to El Salvador to embrace this man.
Not only would no one be making that case, but it didn't happen because it was so clearly understood what that would have meant. I just want to say one more point about this. I remember that they've long since come back, but pre 9/11, there used to be in Times Square and wherever else the extremist, cultish black Israelites. Right? They're not. It's not connected to Islam, although they sort of echo some Nation of Islam stuff. But they're a weird, extreme group that would yell about the Jews on the street corners. They disappeared after 9/11. They had nothing to do with it, right? But they went underground for years. You didn't see them on the corner. So there's just been such a change in the culture and in our politics that now we sit back and stroke our chins and go, oh, well, this is free speech and this is what this country's about. And you're allowed to criticize the government and blah, blah, blah.
Right. I mean, I think there's a larger difference that explains this divergence that you said. I mean, it's just a different country than it was in 2001. Right. There are far more international students at our universities today than there were in 2001. I think that if we had another major terrorist attack on this country, which I pray that doesn't happen, but I think we would have encampments blaming America. I don't
want foreign students over here who hate our country, who want to slaughter Americans or want to slaughter some subset of Americans, including my own Jewish group. All right, I just don't want people who are likely to be Muslim terrorists. I don't want people who are our enemies coming over as foreign exchange students. I think we have too many foreign students at our universities who hate America, who want to slaughter Americans, who are committed to damaging America. And I'm all on board with Trump stopping immigration from those countries that tend to produce a ton of terrorists. Right? And even if these students aren't terrorists, why are we educating people who hate us and who want to harm us? So I am all for being highly selective of the people we allow into this country, whether as immigrants, as tourists, and particularly as foreign students, right? It should be overwhelmingly a privilege that we accord to our allies, right? Not to countries that are shithole countries.
I think because the structure is there. And one reason why a lot of these Trump policies are good, in my view, is that they're attacking the structure that had been built up over time. And that was outlined by Daniel Pletka in commentary last year. Some of these executive orders in recent weeks in particular, the transparency executive order, among others, goes right to the heart of what Pletka was talking about in that essay about the anti-Semitism network that these foreign governments, hello, Qatar, have been building up over time. And the international students, that's the thing. That's why we're having these arguments about Khalil and They're not Americans. They're not Americans.
I think it's important. I have in front of me Judge Crawford, the judge who ruled that, as I say, that Madawi presents no danger to his community or to others. There are two key claims the government made in its effort to maintain custody over him after his arrest at his citizenship interview. One is this affidavit from a gun enthusiast at a gun club in 20.
And the chat says, let the hot girls in. Well, the hot girls overwhelmingly aren't coming from dysfunctional, anti-American, hateful, terrorist, trashy countries, right? They come from other places.
15, where Madawi said, I like to kill Jews. And then in 2019, he was apparently stopped at a border crossing of some with drugs, which he claimed to be prescription drugs. Here is how the judge deals with that in his finding. The court has considered the allegations made by the gunsmith in 2015. If true, they are highly damaging to Mr. Madawi's chances of release and of having any future in the United States at all. In 2015, the FBI conducted a thorough investigation of the allegations and found no basis to act. Had the statements attributed to Mr. Madawi been true, they would have resulted in some official response. In a case of the dog that did not bark, the FBI concluded its investigation without taking action. That decision gives rise to a reasonable inference that the agency charged with the protection of the public from crime found no basis for proceeding against Mr. Madawi in any venue. 10 years have passed since that time without any criminal charge, except for a referral to a state-run diversion program in 2019 concerning a potential drug offense. The record of that referral and any citation has been expunged in the normal course. Now,
okay, so here's the big difference between left and right, and it's the attitude towards foreigners, outsiders, right? The traditional right-wing nationalist, tribalist perspective is to have some skepticism about outsiders and to need some strong evidence that they will be good for us before we just open ourselves up and become vulnerable. It's just like a smart, discerning woman doesn't go to bed with just any man. She exercises great discretion. Well, the wise country exercises great discretion. The wise individual exercises great discretion about who it gets vulnerable with. Right? You would want your daughter to exercise great discretion and to be very, very sure before she gets vulnerable with some man that he's a good and decent man. And the wise person doesn't become vulnerable to anyone, right? I open up to strangers, right? I've opened up to strangers in the workplace or in a public park or on a bus, but I employ judgment, right? I don't just open up indiscriminately to anyone. I am basing it off some science that this person is worthy of me being vulnerable with. So a country, an individual, a woman, your daughter, right? You want people exercising great discretion before becoming vulnerable. And the traditional right-wing approach to life is that you need some strong evidence before you open up and become vulnerable to an outsider and a stranger. The left-wing perspective on life is much easier in opening up and being friendly and having intercourse with strangers. And sometimes the left-wing attitude is more adaptive to reality, and sometimes the right-wing attitude is more adaptive to reality. I am not evenly disposed between the two choices. Right? I'm right-wing. I believe that you should be very careful, and you should demand some pretty good evidence before you make yourself vulnerable to strangers. And another big difference between the left and right is that if you're on the right, you want to severely punish people who do terrible things. Right? To be on the left means that you're much more forgiving. You're not nearly as much into punishment. Right? Punishment, which always contains an element of vengeance, is a right-wing thing. Right? We are at ease with punishing people who do bad things. Right? The left-wing orientation is to rehabilitate, to keep the punishment as mild as possible. Right? The elite attitude is that vengeance is somehow a dirty word. Right? If you're a trad, you don't think that vengeance is a dirty word. You think that vengeance is normal, natural, and healthy if appropriate. Right? We shouldn't just be all out with vengeance. We should look to deliver appropriate amounts of vengeance and appropriate amounts of punishment for people who do terrible things.
I'm reading this out because this is the judge saying, look, the FBI looked into this thing where he said, I like to kill Jews, and found no basis to act or move. Okay. So that's the 2015 FBI. That's the Obama.
Okay, I don't want some foreigner here who talks about killing any group, right? If he talked about killing whites, blacks, gays, lesbians, Seventh-day Adventists, Jews, Muslims, I don't want him here.
FBI, that's a dovish immigration FBI, whose people might have said, well, you're allowed to say you want to kill Jews, when it is not the policy of the Obama administration, despite efforts that people are making to say that Obama loved to deport people. They weren't deporting green card holders, and they weren't doing stuff like that, or hardly at all. The judge seems to be implying that the gunsmith's affidavit is a lie, or failing that the FBI looked into it and did a thorough examination and found no basis to act. How does he know that the investigation was thorough? How does he know the FBI, someone didn't just tell this to the FBI, and the FBI said, the hell with it, who cares? This is just
how many times have there been attacks that later we find out the person was on the FBI's, watch radar or whatever? Yeah. I mean, that is unfortunate. Right.
So I am much more on the cautious side of things. All right, if you have reason to believe that someone's a threat and they're not a citizen, then get rid of them. Just deport them. All right, you can do that. All right, on the directory of the Secretary of State.
Fortunately, all too frequent.
All the time.
Almost every time there is an attack, it involves somebody who was on the radar, right? So in any case, this is an astonishing thing to say. He has to deal with it in the course of the fight. And by the way, this may in fact be the way that Mahdawi is deported from the United States. Remember what you were being led to believe yesterday in the coverage of this court case is somehow that he was found innocent or something like that. That is not what happened yesterday. What happened was that the judge said that he did not have to stay in custody while he was defending himself against the government's efforts to deport him. If the Secretary of State determines that his presence in the United States is inimical.
All right, who are these judges who keep releasing bloodthirsty and possibly bloodthirsty, criminally inclined, nasty, antisocial people? All right, these judges are rarely people on the right. They are almost always people of the left. All right, the left and their judges is so tolerant, is so against punishment, so loathes vengeance, so loathes racism and discrimination, and recognizing the basic fact that different groups have different gifts and pose different risks, that different groups are troubled by different things and pose different types of threats. And if someone's not a citizen, like, why are we keeping them here when there is some significant evidence that they're a threat? And these killers who get released by judges, it's always judges on the left, right? They think it's great to release these bloodthirsty killers into our midst. I'm not so thrilled by that, right? We control the amount of crime that we have in this country. If we simply put away for a long time people who commit violent crime, right, we could drive our murder rate down to 1% of what it is now. We get to choose our murder rate by how severely we punish violent crime, right? Once someone commits one bodily assault, I say throw them in prison for life, right? Just throw them in prison, throw away the key. We don't need these people. Most importantly, you're preventing them from reproducing, right? We don't want these thugs, right? These super predators, right? These rapists and torturers, these bullies and murderers, all right? We don't want them around, and we definitely don't want them reproducing. And that's the right-wing instinct, is to remove them from polite society. The left-wing instinct is to try to rehabilitate them, to try to integrate them, to try to spend money on them and give them therapy and help them with their feelings.
To the conduct of our foreign policy, there is almost no recourse that he will have for deportation, because the only way that case will be resolved is for the Supreme Court eventually to hear this very specific case and deal with the question of whether the law says the Secretary of State has pretty unambiguous power to decide that someone is pursuing something that is inimical to the foreign policy interests of the United States and to act on it. And moreover, say Mahdawi was the head one of the two heads of the...
You can look at a nation state and get a pretty good idea whether or not immigrants from that country are likely to be a good fit for the United States of America, right? Immigrants from Japan, not a threat. Immigrants from Northern Europe, not a threat. Immigrants from Slovenia, not a threat. Immigrants from some of the more intense parts of the Middle East, such as Pakistan or Afghanistan, big threat. Syria, big threat. Iran, Iraq, right? Frequently big threats, right? If they are strongly identifying Muslims who give money to terror, who openly support mass murder and genocide, I say don't admit them and don't admit their family, extended family, their brethren. We don't need those people here. We have to start looking at the world collectively. We already look at the world collectively. We have to be open and honest and forthright and state this is how the world works, right? That people are inevitably going to be judged by the behavior of their fellow tribesmen, right? By their fellow nationals, by their fellow members of their race or religion or tribe.
Efforts to promote a foreign policy view on the campus of Columbia University in the wake of October 7th that directly involved the conduct of American foreign policy in the Middle East. They were attempting to influence American foreign policy in the Middle East in ways that I believe are inimical to American foreign policy, that Marco Rubio may deem inimical to American foreign policy, and that while he may have the right to say whatever it is that he wants to say, he does not have the right to say it within our borders. He does not. We do. He does not. We are born citizens of the United States. He is not.
This actually, though, reminds me a bit of a broader sort of cultural challenge that those of us who would make...
Right. Membership has its privileges. Age has its privileges. Accomplishment has its privileges. All right. Vouchers should have their privileges. All right. When you get a driver's license, you should have to have at least 10 law-abiding adults vouch for you, and those adults should have to pay a price if you drive recklessly. If you get to own a gun, you should have to have a certain number of adults who vouch for you, law-abiding adults who have no felony convictions, vouch for you, and then if you do something heinous, they should have to pay a price. We need to start reacting and adjusting our political and legal system to the corporate nature of reality. Reality is not individualist in the main. Reality is overwhelmingly corporatist. People overwhelmingly experience the suffering and the rewards of their group membership. Right? If you're an upstanding individual and dozens and hundreds of people vouch for you, then that should come with certain privileges. If you can't get 10 law-abiding, non-felonious adults to vouch for you, then your choices should be restricted. If you're a highly accomplished person who's a law-abiding citizen and pays a vast amount of tax and doesn't suck off the government teat, that should come with privileges. Membership, accomplishment, what's going on with your group and how your group contributes to society or how your group damages society, that should openly, explicitly, clearly, as part of our public discussion, right, come into account for how people are treated and how we relate to people, right? If you know that one group, say, commits murder at a rate 20 times higher than another group, then the normal, rational thing to do is to be highly suspicious of that group and not to want to, for example, rent property to it or not want your daughter's dating members of a group. So Asians, right, particularly Asian women, right, they most likely take the best care of your property if you're renting, right? If you're driving. I was walking down the street the other day and I was reckless. I wasn't watching where I was going, but thank God the driver who was coming up on me was an older Asian woman, about the most cautious type of driver around. And Asians, the stereotype is that they drive cautiously. They don't just drive cautiously. They live their entire lives in a cautious, thoughtful manner. And so they have higher family solidarity than pretty much any other group. They have higher per hour earnings. They have higher savings. They have higher educational accomplishment. They have fewer STDs. They commit fewer crimes. Right? These traits, right, they display across a wide spectrum. And if you're part of a group that is highly law-abiding and highly contributing to society, your membership in that group will inevitably come with privileges, and it should come with privileges, and we should be able to say it out loud. Right? Asians are overwhelmingly a massive asset to this country, talking Asians from Northeast Asia with above average IQs, with high educational attainment, with high earning. They pay a huge amount of tax. They commit a minuscule amount of crime. They spread a minuscule amount of STDs. And their great behavior, right, should come with privileges. And if Harvard was to discriminate against them for being boring, then I'm glad to see Harvard coming under scrutiny. That Harvard wants to discriminate against this highly productive, law-abiding, studious group is repulsive.
This argument, I agree with you, and it struck me when the Harvard anti-Semitism report came out, that at the exact same time, they also had to do this moral equivalence and have the additional report on supposed Islamophobia. And this actually, post 9/11, has been a push-pull that really conservatives have not quite won this battle, although I think we need to. And it's this. We should be able to show violence, threats, anti-Semitism, without also having to give this polite nod to Islam being a religion of peace. In the case of a lot of these activists, and if you read those two reports, which I did, it's fascinating to see that the complaints of the Jewish students, violence, threats of violence, being blocked from moving around campus, hostility from faculty and administrators. And then you look at the complaints of the Muslim students, they're like, I felt like I couldn't really express myself fully. And that, to me, I mean, it's darkly comical, but it's also horrifying. But there is this sense, there's a whole wing of people in this country, not all of whom are liberals, I would say, who like this idea of tolerance. And we saw it post 9/11, a few months out from 9/11. We're seeing it now with regard to these sorts of figures who are matters of controversy. And what I would say to that is, you know what, tolerance is excellent, but when intolerance rears its head and it's backed up by threats of violence, tolerance has to cease, and protection of the people under threat must begin. And I think it's difficult for a lot of Americans to make that distinction because they don't want to be seen as intolerant.
Yeah, the two reports are incredible because the one on anti-Semitism documents things that actually happened, right? The one on anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian bias is all about people's feelings.
Yeah, feels.
And a higher percentage of the Muslim students who were interviewed say they feel afraid to speak up on campus than the Jewish students who were.
So, which majority Muslim country would you most like to live in? Right? Which countries have become more Muslim and more free and more prosperous? Right? Where has a large influx of Muslims dramatically improved the quality of life and the quality of the economy and the quality of freedom into which first world advanced societies? Right? Name me one. Just give me one nation that's become more Muslim and more free. Name me one.
Who were questioned along the same line.
This was the subject of Abe's excellent newsletter yesterday, so I commend to you Abe Greenwald's Daily News.
Okay, so I'm not exactly on board with the Commentary Magazine crew in many different areas of life, but they're very smart, and they have some thoughtful things to say at times. And out of the entire group, my favorite is Matthew Continetti, who's pretty fair. Right? He sides with the National Review perspective. Right? He's an establishment Republican, but he bends over backwards in his fairness to the other parts of the right that he does not side with.
The second thing I'd like to say is, you know how while we live in the Trump era, we're always trying to kind of post hoc ascribe intellectual influences or say, oh, these are the books that best represent what's happening through Trump at any given moment. In the first term, of course, the books that we associated with Donald Trump was Hillbilly Elegy by a certain J.D. Vance, but also a book called The Virtue of Nationalism by the Israeli political philosopher Yoram Hazony. Those two books were said to be the kind of texts you needed to read if you wanted to understand what was happening. Trump's appeal to working class Americans in the case of Hillbilly Elegy, and then also kind of the theory of nationalism that informed Trump's comments consistently that he is a nationalist with Hazony. I have to say, 100 days into Trump 2, the book to read is The Age of Entitlement by our friend and colleague Christopher Caldwell. Came out in 2020.
Charlie Kirk read this book, and it made him incredibly based. Right? It moved him to the right. It helped him develop a hearty skepticism of the civil rights industrial complex, and it also contributed to him hosting Steve Saylor on his show.
The reception was pretty hostile by the intellectual elite. It was picked up by Tucker Carlson in particular, and Tucker Carlson's support, I think, helped make The Age of Entitlement a bestseller. But now, if you were to read Chris's book, which is exactly about how the Civil Rights Act of 1964 evolved into something very different than what its legislators intended, you would have a clear-eyed view of what Trump is doing abolishing DEI, affirmative action, and now a disparate impact from the executive branch, and attempting to reset the American government at the level of equal opportunity, as people thought we were going to get when the Civil Rights Act was enacted in 1964.
So, Glib Medley writes in the chat that harmony fell off the radar. America was overwhelmingly a harmonious society until the late 1960s, until the Civil Rights era. You did not have to lock your car. You did not have to lock your home in the San Fernando Valley into the 1960s. Right? America did not have its astronomical rates of violent crime until the mid-1960s. Right? We had a harmonious, relatively cohesive and high-trust and thriving society up until the mid to late 1960s. And what destroyed things was opening up immigration in astronomical amounts from all over the world without regard to the quality of the people that we were getting. And then this incredibly intrusive civil rights industrial complex, which Christopher Caldwell describes so powerfully in the book, The Age of Entitlement. Right, this is Mark Halperin. He's got a new podcast called Next Up with Mark Halperin.
Confidence in any of the three of them at that level of performance. And it's likability, it's confidence, but it's also an understanding of what these different venues are. And of course, now today, there are way more venues than there used to be. There's this program, there's Megan's program, there's so many different programs people can go on. But you still have to understand the national conversation. You have to understand America. So we talk about some of the people who are discussed now as prospective candidates. And I'm gonna tell you about my skepticism. It extends to the whole field. Gavin Newsom will be here later. Arguably, of all the people talked about for running, the two Californians, Gavin Newsom and Kamala Harris, are the two with the most experience in this realm, being part of the national conversation, okay? So I'm least skeptical about them on that measure, although I'm skeptical about them both for other reasons. But all these other people, Governor Shapiro, Pennsylvania, Cory Booker, who's run before, they just don't have this level of experience, whether it's over a long period of time like Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, or a very concentrated way like George W. Bush and Barack Obama. They just don't have that. So Gretchen Whitmer, governor of Michigan, big state, talked about as a potential candidate for a while, talked about potentially being running mate for Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. And again, I got nothing against her. She's obviously a talented politician. Being able to get elected governor of Michigan, that alone is a huge feat. But the gap between even a mega state and running for president successfully, again, it's massive. Gretchen Whitmer knows a lot of people, I bet she thinks. Gretchen Whitmer thinks, well, I survived a lot of controversies, a lot of pressure situations. Case study, Gretchen Whitmer. COVID. She was governor during COVID. A huge test for anybody in elective office. A lot of pressure. Pressure from business, pressure from parents, pressure from public health officials. I watch Gretchen Whitmer closely. And again, I'm using her as a case study, but I think what I'm saying about her applies to everybody else who I see named as a possible candidate. Even Pete Buttigieg, who served in the cabinet. Okay? Here's Gretchen Whitmer during COVID. Okay? A couple things happened that just really stayed with me. First of all, Gretchen Whitmer's husband during COVID wanted to take his boat out. Was against the rules to go.
So, Glib Medley apparently meant to talk about, we haven't heard much about Yoram Hazony. He didn't meant to say harmony, but I want to I want to go off on harmony. It only takes one bad apple in a synagogue, in a church, in a stamp club, in a rowing club, in a gym, in a workplace to just destroy harmony. And we should think about this explosive ability of dysfunction to have astronomical effects. It's so easy for one bad person to devastate the lives of thousands of people while accomplishing good things, right? It's really hard to make dramatic strides forward in goodness. So one bad move by a driver will wreck commutes and will wreck the day of possibly tens of thousands of people. So we should be very careful about who we allow to have a driver's license. There was a leading CBS News correspondent who was killed because he was in a limousine, and the limousine driver was just some immigrant who was completely incapable of being a good driver. Just a horrible person, a horrible track record. Should never have been in the country, let alone driving around members of our media elite. So you want to maintain harmony, right? You want to have any kind of community or a good family life, all right? You can't allow the poison in. And that's how we should be as a country. We cannot allow the poison in. We cannot allow people to rise except on the basis of excellence.
Oh, take your boat out. Purported Northern Michigan boat launch request fuels controversy for Whitmer from the Detroit News. Then 108, New York Times. Okay? Michigan governor says husband request was, quote, failed attempt at humor. Her husband basically said, I'm going to get my boat out because I'm the governor's husband. Again, just bad judgment. You could say, well, that's a one-off. He lost his head. He really wanted to go out in the boat. Also during COVID, Gretchen Whitmer decides, even though there's a travel ban, people say you shouldn't be traveling out of state. Gretchen Whitmer decided to travel out of state 3 times in 6 months during COVID, at least once to go visit her mom. Understandable. But this is not the ancient history. This was not that long ago. It's not just bad judgment, but it demonstrates a lack of awareness of what it takes to do this thing under excruciating pressure. Now, I will tell you something that hasn't been reported as far as I know. Donald Trump is incredibly interested in presidential politics generally. He's super interested in the 2028 race, and his bandwidth is crazy. You would think, well, he's got more.
Okay, there's the killer phrase. What's the phrase that I am going to jump on there? That's Mark Halperin noting that Donald Trump's bandwidth is crazy big. You know what's another term for bandwidth? It's IQ. And so anyone who says or tries to argue that Donald Trump is stupid is just obviously wrong. They're lying. Donald Trump is a very smart man, right? To have a huge bandwidth means that you have a huge intelligence, right? Doesn't mean he necessarily reads books, right? Not all people who are incredibly smart read books. But huge bandwidth means huge IQ, and therefore, because he's got that big brain, right, he is capable of doing things that people with a smaller bandwidth and smaller IQ are not capable of.
Other things to worry about as president. He does, but he's really interested in who's going to be the Republican nominee, probably J.D. Vance, who's going to be the Democratic nominee. And his interest is not passive. He wants to muck around in the Democratic race. He wants to be a player in figuring out who the Democrats are going to nominate. So Gretchen Whitmer, 3 weeks ago, goes to the White House to try to lobby for different things for Michigan, including support for this air base that needed some federal help. And the president, unbeknownst to her, horrible staff work for her team, brings her into the Oval Office. You've probably seen this photo, famous picture the New York Times took. Gretchen Whitmer's in the Oval Office, Trump signing executive orders attacking Democrats, okay, and going after his enemies, as many of the executive orders have.
So the higher your IQ, the more capable of empathy you are. So not all high IQ people are highly empathic, but IQ gives you the ability to be empathic. Just like weighing 300 pounds does not guarantee you a job in the NFL, right? But you are not going to play on the offensive line in the National Football League if you weigh under 200 pounds, right? So a high cognitive ability is a prerequisite for many levels of accomplishment. Oh, Ricardo, $10 super chat. John Podhorace's podcast is low energy. Bring back Tucker. So I like both of them. They both have their moments, right? Tucker is nuts half the time. John Podhorace is nuts at least half the time. But they both have their moments, all right? Different groups, different individuals have their different gifts. And so I fast forward through John Podhorace and I skip Tucker Carlson when they're nuts, and I revere and respect them for the good work that they do. So the higher your IQ, the more ability you have to be empathic, the more likely you are to be law-abiding, the more likely you are to earn and to pay taxes rather than to suck off the government teat. The more clearly you see the future, so the less likely you are to be criminally inclined, and the more likely you are to see around corners, right? And Donald Trump has many extraordinary abilities. He's an idiot in many ways as well, but he's not low IQ.
And she's in there, and Trump talks, praises her, whatever. She then somehow gets it in her head that she can make herself invisible by holding a blue folder up to her face. So she holds the blue folder up to her face. It produced one of the most humiliating political photographs I can recall seeing, because she's there in the Oval Office trying to hide the fact that she's in there with Donald Trump. Okay, so that was bad. Now, flash forward to 3 weeks later, and Trump's going to Michigan to celebrate 100 days in office, give a big speech. She didn't go to that. She did greet him, though, when he arrived in the state on the tarmac in Michigan, as governors do, even if the president's from the other party. And once again, snookered by Donald Trump. He comes down the steps of Air Force One, you can see here, and you see Gretchen Whitmer puts out her hand to get a handshake, and Trump hugs her. And he hugs her in a way that she can't avoid hugging him back, patting him a couple times on the shoulder. Now, some people say, well, that's great for her, right? That's great because it shows that she's helping to fight for her state. Then later at the event, Trump introduces her, and she's not expecting to speak, but once again, bad staff work. She's tricked into speaking. Listen to how awkward it is, where she basically thanks Trump without saying his name.
I want to thank you very much, Gretchen. Good job. Thank you.
Okay, so I just feel energized to do this live stream because there's just so much damn nonsense in the elite media, in the New York Times, all right, started off by saying that helicopter crash taking out a passenger airplane in Washington, D.C., that it was the factors causing it were just very, very complicated. When no, there was just one factor causing it, one terrible female pilot. Then this obsession with Ukraine as though it has anything to do with vital American interests. It has nothing to do with vital American interests. Now, I'm interested in Ukraine, and there's a terrific TV series. If you're interested in Ukraine or Eastern Europe or Russia versus Poland, then watch the TV series on Max. It's called The Eastern Gate, 6-part series. It's a Polish TV series. Excellent. I'm all for learning about it, but it doesn't fool me into thinking that what happens in Gaza or what happens in Israel, right? Israel has great emotional meaning to me, but it doesn't have much to do with the well-being of American citizens. What happens in Ukraine doesn't have anything to do with vital American interests. And then this overwhelming elite consensus, particularly in the media, that if you are not primarily about economic efficiency, that if we don't run our society on the basis primarily of economic efficiency, then you're a retard, then you're a moron, then you are stupid, as though there could be anything higher in society than economic efficiency, as though there could be anything more good, more beautiful, more true than people just constantly rationalizing their lives, making them as economically as efficient, moving away from everyone that they know and love for the sake of a better job, right? And it's just taken for granted by our elites and by our media that we should be operating our society according to GDP figures, according to that which will produce the most economic efficiency, the most economic growth, right? The highest stock market. And I don't buy that, right? We should run the United States of America primarily for the benefit of Americans, not Ukrainians, not Israelis, not the Japanese or the Australians or the French or the Africans, not according to some academic perspective on economic efficiency, not according to trade economist models of what efficiency looks like. We should run our country on the basis of what's good for our citizens, right? We shouldn't subordinate our citizens, our people, right, our fellow Americans to the gods of economic theory or economic calculus or these visions of free trade or economic efficiency. There are more important things in life than GDP growth and economic efficiency and fulfilling the targets and the recommendations of economists and their various abstract models, right? Let's think about what kind of society do we want to have, right? I think we should have a society where pretty much every American can get a decent job and earn enough money to support himself and to support a family and to have dignity, right? And to have the ability to stand on his own 2 feet and to feel like he contributes. And to me, that's more important than 1 or 2 or 3 points of GNP growth or 1,000 points of stock market highs or fulfilling this or that free market, free trade economic dictum, right? Let's restore the dignity of Americans, right, earning their way in life and contributing to society, and let's make policy, political, social, cultural, economic, based on what is best for our fellow citizens, right? So our trade policy just completely went off the rails in the 1990s, and it's just increasingly obvious now. I'm looking at rereading Robert Lighthouse's book. What's it called here? No Trade is Free. Changing Course, Taking on China and Helping America's Workers. Right. So the well-being of American workers should matter to us because they are our fellow Americans. Right. We should be more concerned about the well-being, the prosperity, and most of all, the dignity of our fellow Americans than we are about the Chinese. Right. We have lost about 20 million manufacturing jobs due to free trade. We have exploding trade deficits, well over $1 trillion. We need to start insisting on fair trade in our markets, reciprocal access in foreign markets, and we have had decade after decade of poor trade deals. And I'm not someone who's just universally against free trade. All right, economic efficiency is one good value among many. All right, the ludicrous nature of youth in its proclamations on life is to seize on one or two good values and then make them absolute and look at them as though they have no competitor. In reality, good things, good values exist in a constellation. They're in constant tension. It's wonderful to have freedom, but it's also wonderful to belong to other people and to have commitment to be married, to have a family, to be part of a tribe, a community, a synagogue, a church, which will necessarily restrict your freedom. So freedom and belonging, all right, are at odds with one another. There's some tension there. And so they exist in a constellation. And that's how we should be thinking about various parts of our economic and trade policy, right? It's not that we should just embrace extreme amounts of protection and have no regard for economic efficiency, right? I think economic efficiency is good, right? I think that a good drink, right? There's a time and a place where a good alcoholic drink is probably a good thing. There's a time and a place for all sorts of different values, but don't pursue one absurdly to the detriment of all other values. And we should be setting up our trade and our economic and our political policies and our legal policies on the basis of what's best for our fellow Americans. Right? We need a balance in trade. We can't keep transferring trillions of dollars of our wealth to foreign countries in return for their cheap consumer products. Right? So we no longer need to use trade and to give foreign countries, fantastic deals to gain friends, right? We should put a higher priority on the well-being of our fellow Americans, right? So for some people, trade is really all about just getting the cheapest possible products for our consumers. Well, no country has become great by consuming. You do not consume your way to greatness. Every great economy has become a great economy by employing protectionism. And Nathan Kaufness rejoined on Twitter, well, every great economy has had murders. Are you saying that we need murders to have a great economy? No, I don't find that a compelling argument. Right? Given that we have zero examples of any country becoming economically great, any sizable country becoming great and powerful and rich without employing protectionism, we should probably have some open-mindedness to some forms of protectionism, right? What's more important, cheap TVs or having a solid manufacturing economy where people, our fellow Americans with average and below average IQs, can enjoy a life of dignity and contribution, which they're not going to have in a service economy, right? Half of our service jobs could be shipped overseas, right? But if we develop a strong manufacturing base and provide incentives for keeping it here, then our fellow Americans with average and below average IQs can have a better job, and then they can have a stronger family. They can get married, they can have kids, and they can have safer, more prosperous communities. They can have dignity, right? They can have a reason for being. We can construct our economic policies on the basis of the common good. Right, not on the basis of various economic models or an extra 1% of GDP growth or economic efficiency. Right, I think there are many virtues to some parts of free trade, and I like free markets. Right, I'm not for autarky, where we just produce everything ourselves. I'm saying there's probably a pretty good case for balance. Right, so perhaps some level of protection for some industries. Right, and it's not that free trade has just been uniformly bad for America. We are the second largest exporting nation after China. Overseas markets help support millions of American jobs. Global competition is essential for promoting excellence. Right, our companies should be able to go head to head with foreign companies to remain sharp. We want our companies, our businesses, our technologies, right, integrating cutting-edge overseas technology to improve their own. We should collaborate in research and development with friendly, secure nations, right? But our service sector, right, it's a net exporter, but these surpluses are quite small. They are much less reliable than manufacturing. They're difficult to count compared to goods crossing a border, and they're only available to the high IQ. So the way that we count the service sector trade surplus that we have is that we count foreign students, right, coming to our universities and foreign tourists. These are counted as foreign service export categories, right? Over 80% of our foreign service surplus is accounted for by royalty payments for the use of intellectual property, which is paid back to U.S. companies by their foreign subsidiaries and financial services, where the U.S. has a large competitive advantage, but they don't employ hardly any Americans, and the royalty payments, right, essentially go to tax avoidance schemes where the biggest American companies place their headquarters in Ireland so that they only have to pay 11% corporate tax. So maybe we need to start rethinking and rebalancing the way we do things.
I plan to speak, but I'm on behalf of all the military men and women who serve our country and serve so honorably on behalf of the state of Michigan. I am really damn happy we're here to celebrate this recapitalization at Selfridge. It's crucial for the Michigan economy. It's crucial for the men and women here, for our homeland security and our future. So thank you. I'm so grateful that this announcement was made today, and I appreciate all the work. Thank you.
Okay, so if Gretchen Whitmer ends up running for president, the blue folder in front of her face, the handshake, the awkward remarks, it may not matter. She's putting herself in the same camp as Governor Newsom, saying, I'm fine with being nice to Trump when it's in my state's interest. But what I see here is not just bad.
Okay, great question in the chat. You used to have so many people discussing topics with you online. What happened? Well, a majority of those people realized it was not in their interest to be appearing online discussing controversial topics. The Overton window shifted after Charlottesville. And I shifted my show in a higher IQ direction. So many of the shows that had great, vigorous discussions with lots of people, right? All the shows that I'm thinking of from 2018, I'm not aware of them. Any of them are still doing that. It's very hard to keep the band together.
Staff work, but not playing at the level required to get through the gauntlet. Now, somebody's going to get through the gauntlet, and if I'm right that they're all pretty weak, like a second-grade soccer league, even if all the teams are bad, somebody wins the championship. But my caution here, my main message on this is, if you think that it's easy to run for president, and if you think...
So between year 2000 and 2016, America lost 5 million manufacturing jobs, right? Wages have stagnated in many fields, such as construction on the West Coast, for 60 years. For 60 years, due to absurd levels of immigration. When I went back to Australia for a year after high school in 1984-85, right, I was making about $25 an hour American. When I came back to California, right, the only job I could find that had full-time hours in the summer paid $4 an hour, right? Because Australia doesn't have huge amounts of immigration, and it certainly doesn't have huge amounts of illegal immigration. So median household income has stagnated in this country for about 4 decades, right? And with it, right, the social cohesion, social trust, the very fabric of our society has frayed under free trade, right? We have had an epidemic of deaths of despair since we implemented NAFTA in the mid-1990s, right? Among white middle-aged adults without a college education, right? Death from cirrhosis of the liver increased by 50% between 1999 and 2013. Suicides increased by 78%. Drug and alcohol overdoses increased by 323%. From 2014 to 2017, the increase in deaths of despair led to the first decrease in life expectancy in the United States over a 3-year period since the 1918 flu epidemic. So this is not solely due to our free trade policy. Right? Automation, productivity gains, foreign currency manipulation, financial crisis of 2008, all have played roles. But the offshoring of many of our manufacturing jobs for average and below average IQ Americans, right, has devastated large swaths of this country. And I think we've become a little bit more sophisticated now to understand there is no such thing as free trade. Right? Free trade is a unicorn. It is a figment of the Anglo-American imagination, and having an imagination is not a bad thing. Just like the Anglo-American thing to treat people primarily as individuals is a beautiful policy to adopt in certain circumstances. But if you have a universalist moral outlook and you import people into your country with a tribalist outlook who believe in very different moral standards for people outside of their group compared to within their group, that is going to destroy the social contract within your society. It's going to destroy social cohesion and social trust. All right, so aside from a few hardcore ideologues who dominate elite discussions about trade, pretty much no one else believes in free trade. Why? Because all great economies have been built behind a wall of protection, often with government money and with national policies towards protecting and developing certain key industries. The British Industrial Revolution of the 19th century was created with a wall of tariffs. The late 19th century explosion of American industry was the product of protectionism and subsidies. Think about the great American railroads. They would not have been built without the grant of free land per mile. The manufacturing companies of countries of Japan, Germany, China all benefited during their development from tariffs, other barriers, and subsidies. So given that we have no examples of free trade creating a wealthy, sizable country, maybe we should have a little bit more respect for the thoughtful use of protection. Now, in virtually all elite discussions about the economy, it is taken for granted that the number one consideration should be some abstract notion of economic efficiency. But it is an article of faith, and it's basically the only perspective that you hear in elite media discussion. Right? The sole objective of trade policy should be market efficiency. Right? Lower tariffs and lowering non-tariff barriers reduce the costs of producing, distributing goods and services. That makes society better off. That's the argument. And there are advantages to lower prices when you think of Americans as consumers. Problem is, adherents of this view seldom consider how this single-minded, abstract pursuit of efficiency affects the men and women who actually do the producing. Right? Free trade is taken as a given in our elite media discussion, not as an approach that deserves scrutiny and questioning. So Robert Lighthizer suggests, Trump suggests, I suggest we should envision the type of society that we want, and then, in the light of this vision for the common good, develop a trade policy to fit that vision. But economists and the elite do the opposite. They start from the proposition, from an abstract proposition that free trade should just reign, should not be questioned, and then argue that society should adapt. And if people turn out to be losers from free trade, well, we just retrain them, right? We take all these car manufacturing workers who have been laid off and we train them to be coders, but that doesn't work, right? Now, the free trade perspective is the benefits of all these cheap consumer goods for the masses, that will outweigh the costs, and we'll just retrain these factory workers to write computer programs. Right? It's just absurd.
I think being successful as a governor or senator or business person is enough. It's not. Have you been in the national conversation? Have you been talking to people about America? And I don't see it in Gretchen Whitmer, but I don't see it in almost any of these other people. And I think Donald Trump is going to do his best to muck around and embarrass and humiliate and taunt all the Democrats to try to figure out how he can weaken the entire party so his chosen candidate, which I think will be J.D. Vance, will work.
Some people around Joe Biden knew more than they let on, but that there hasn't been very much, or any, for the most part, acknowledgement of the press's failure to cover it, things that were happening in the open, and the press has continued, for the most part, failure to acknowledge that it wasn't like, oh, we missed it because we weren't looking closely enough, but rather they knew what was happening and they just declined to do it, either because they were browbeat by the Biden administration or they didn't want to help Donald Trump win. What have I left out in terms of the current state of play or gotten wrong?
Well, you know, I don't want to sound like an extremist on this point, but I do think that one of the other things that's left out of this conversation, where they throw up their hands and say, "Oh, sorry guys, we missed the story. We were sympathetic to Biden because we know we can trust the people around him." The press, particularly over the 12 months leading up to the election, played a very deliberate and pretty continuous role in pushing back against conservative criticisms of Biden. Right? I think it actually goes a step further than just, oh, we didn't see it, we ignored it, we should have covered it, we didn't. The media played PR hack in so many cases, whether it was cheap fakes, whether it was the Her report, whether it was other criticisms around Biden and his seeming lack of mental capacity. The press actively, I think, tried to bury the story. So I would put a little.
So again, there's so much on the line here for the credibility of my business, for American history being accurate, and for trying to establish the truth in order to go forward where the press can have credibility with half the country. Okay, so Michael, here is say if you don't follow Drew on X.
So this is Drew Holden here on the upper right. He's a centrist and a keen observer of the news media. This guy here worked for Dr. Jill Biden, then left the administration, and the Biden administration bullied CNN to not have him on anymore, even though the guy's center left. So I've been rereading Robert Lighthouse's book, No Trade is Free, Changing Course, Taking on China, Helping America's Workers. Here's something you don't hear in the news media, that Donald Trump is the first president that we've had in over 80 years who is obsessed with trade. Right? Ronald Reagan, not particularly interested in trade. Joe Biden, not particularly interested in trade. Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, H.W. Bush, Jimmy Carter, Richard Nixon, LBJ, John F. Kennedy, Dwight Eisenhower, Harry Truman, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. None of these American presidents much interested in trade. Right? Donald Trump is the first American president in over 80 years who cares enormously about trade. Right? It's one of the major reasons he chose to run for president. Think about Joe Biden saying, oh, he was running for president because of Charlottesville. I mean, what a ludicrous assertion. Right? Donald Trump is the first American president in over 80 years for whom trade is a top priority.
You're making a big mistake. Drew's masterpieces are threads of media accountability, whereas kids say he brings the receipts. Here's some of the receipts from one of Drew's threads. Number 15, please. And again, in real time, people like me and Drew would read these stories and see these headlines and just be dumbfounded that a serious news organization, put up number 15, please. A serious news organization could, with a straight face, write this. So, Michael, New York Times, Critics Notebook. For Joe Biden, what seems like age might instead be style. In this respect, the president has something in common with Beethoven, Wagner, and Martin Scorsese. Michael, you've been a journalist, you've worked in the government. How could something like that be written? How does that happen?
What's the Critics Notebook? I don't even know what is that, like an opinion piece?
No, it's like a news analysis kind of essay type thing.
Oh, I mean, if they're making excuses for him, sure. I mean, it seems like look, as long as they report the other stuff, you can surely have opinions like that.
Okay, let's get Kip back onto the show. Kip, what's going on, man?
Hey, man, I appreciate you saying a little bit about there's more to equality, there's more to a quality life than GDP. You know what I mean? And and that's a real true statement. And the interest gathering, money lending priesthoods who have, not necessarily overtly, but run societies, even going back to the time of, say, Nebuchadnezzar 5,000 years ago. They do. That's all they care about is the damn GDP. You know what I mean? And
I don't want to go too far. It's good that there are people who care about economic efficiency, but even people who care about economic efficiency have children, have people that they care about, have interests and values. So I don't want to diminish the humanity of people who have excellence in economics or excellence in making money. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being excellent. It's just that I don't believe that we should structure our society with there is just one overwhelming model, an abstract model of economic efficiency to which all other considerations should bow. I think that's outrageous.
I don't know that we've ever had sound money, but this late stage crony capitalism that we're living in now, where you got all these apparatchiks like the New York Times caring more about ideological beliefs and narratives than the truth. They just kind of, maybe it was a contractual agreement that they had to put a little truth in the last paragraph, but it was nowhere in the nut graph when they were describing what the story was about. But that whole thing, maybe we've never had sound money, but I'm just saying the deterioration that we're seeing in the American people isn't solely due to these people that I'm talking about that run these central banks. And, it's no coincidence that the century of central banks has been the century of endless wars, and the century where, since you've been alive, Luke, just been runaway inflation. And, the natural state of things is actually deflation, because you have advancements in tools and efficiency and this sort of thing. But we've lived in an era where that GDP, must go up, so they'll get you to focus. Aren't your paychecks better than they were 10 years, 20 years ago? But your tax burden is higher. Yeah, but your house is more valuable. Yeah, but my tax burden's higher on that house. And that GDP line go up. We're sort of at a precipice now with that $36.6 trillion debt staring us in the face. But not only that, we got people like my dad in the 80s, who's in his 80s, that he's okay with this death by 1,000 cuts that the modern America has become. But he's got the money, and he was in the market long enough to where he can weather it. But what happens after the generation of people like my dad are gone, and the people who are replacing him are supposed to take on the burden of this death by 1,000 cuts? But we lived in an era closer to zero interest rates. You get what I'm saying? There's who's going to pick up that burden, and you want to speak to that? The deterioration.
This is the topic that you're obsessed with, that you will talk about in I would assume pretty much any social setting. It's the same topic that you talked about the first time, and I don't notice any development or refinement. There are some ways that life today is better than it was 10 years or 100 years ago, and there are some ways that it's worse. I don't understand why you're so focused on this one topic without any development or refinement of your thinking here. It's just repetitive.
No, not it's not that. Moore's law, I'm sure, has helped a few things, over the past couple of decades, right? But what I'm trying to get you to see is the societal ills, from all the drug abuse to even little Miss Amelia Earhart LARPing as a soldier / pilot / Democratic, operator or whatever.
You don't think I see the ills of DEI?
Right. But I don't know that Luke Ford, when he hears me belly aching about this sort of thing, I don't think you realize there's a connection to all this. That the reason you see the broken spirits out there, and you see the reason that people aren't nesting together and making families, a lot of that's all connected, Luke. You know what I mean? And I know you just want to focus on how maybe technology has made people's life 10 or 20% better in this area or that area. But if you look at the totality of things, we're not in the early stage of capitalism, are we? We're in the late stage. I mean, think about how flat on their ass Europe and Japan and everybody was in the mid 40s. And you hear people like Amy wax, and people wax poetically about how great the 50s and the 60s was. And it's true. All those countries were flat on their ass, and we had to make cars and refrigerators and washer and dryers for everybody, So, it was great for a while. But I want you to look at all through the 60s, when the factories were operating at peak efficiency and everybody was taking their little hard hats and going in and making things happen. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, I believe it probably started the 60s at 400 or 500, and it probably ended the 60s at 700, 800. And look at it now, 42,000. Are we 50 times more efficient than the hard hat generation of the 1960s that Amy waxes so poetically about? Or
there are some ways that we are 50 times more efficient.
Okay. Well, we just won't talk about my little soapbox thing, and I'll tell you that I saw a goddamn hitchhiker last weekend. How long's it been since you seen that, homeboy?
I think I see them on occasion. I just don't pay attention because I wouldn't pick one up in America. But in Australia, I would. It's just that there's less social cohesion, social trust, and safety here.
Okay. All right. And one other thing there again, it probably relates to my soapbox thing, but I've been hearing some hammering in the background for about the past 2 weeks as they furiously build a house in my neighborhood. And I'm wondering, because see, I see money as like energy potential, you know what I mean? And I've been sitting on way too much money, because I have a little paralysis by analysis. So part of me is like, man, you should take that crew up there and put them to work. Oh, I got a lot, a couple of streets over, and put them to work, But I'm wondering, I just told you I got this worry about who's going to pick up the slack after people like my dad are gone and there's nobody there, to pick up all that burden to pay all those doctors and all that insurance and all those taxes. So I wonder, if we have some sort of contraction, and this is my kind of luck, I'd go out there and turn them loose, spending $300,000 on a beautiful home, and house prices would go down to like $200,000 this time next year, as the contraction starts or whatever. What would be but generally speaking, just like people say with market or with gold or whatever, you put it in there, and eventually, because the money printing will never stop, eventually it's going to go back up. What you're thinking on that?
Yeah, I've got an answer. That there is one answer. The best way to survive unemployment, the best way to survive an economic collapse, the best way to survive an earthquake, the best way to survive dramatic political, military change. It's all the same thing, and that's to have bonds, connections with other people. Right, to think socially, to have a community, a tribe, a group where you have mutual interdependence, where you help each other out, and you'll have some people in the group who have expertise in plumbing, and other people in the group might have expertise in banking, and other people in the group might have expertise with natural disasters, and being connected to other people is the best way to survive inflation, unemployment, social change, political change, cultural change, crime changes. All right, if you need to navigate an increasingly complicated and dangerous world, the most effective way to do it is in concert with a group with whom you are a member, where membership has its privileges and its responsibilities, where you contribute, where you have your area where you can contribute to the group with dignity. And therefore, you're not a free rider, you're a contributor, and so therefore you get to enjoy the benefits of group membership. So you will do much better with an earthquake or with inflation or with home prices halving or home prices doubling if you are connected to other people, and you'll have a much more difficult time navigating all these things, from a broken leg to inflation to economic, cultural, social, or political dislocation if you're isolated.
Yeah. Today finished up the first month me back swimming. Easter started a little bit of a backsliding. I ended up not swimming Easter and maybe 2 days after Easter, but 27 of 30 days I did the swimming. So the muscles for the first couple of weeks were sore, but now I've either got to swim harder or, add a little something to it. Because you know how your body gets used to it after 30 days of something? Your body kind of adjusts. And if I still want to feel the same effects, I'll have to amp it up or do a little bit of running or do something.
Well, the best way to maintain a workout is to be connected with other people, right? If your friends are fit and they value fitness, you are much more likely to be fit. If your friends are monogamous, you're much more likely to be monogamous. If your friends patronize whores, you're much more likely to patronize whores. So the people that you surround yourself with will have a profound effect on your level of fitness, your level of sanity, your level of effectiveness and efficiency in life. So from working out to navigating inflation, You're better off being bonded with other people.
Well, you're like a damn wind-up toy. You just pull the toy and hello, hi, this is Mickey Mouse type of a thing comes out. Especially with certain topics when you're right up in your wheelhouse with 12 steps or Alexander technique. It's hilarious. It's fun.
Well, wait,
actually.
you were in the armed services, and so you would have done a lot of exercises and a lot of training with other guys, and you were able to achieve levels of fitness that you would be quite unlikely to achieve on your own because you were part of a tribe.
Yeah, that's true, but I actually achieved better fitness after I became a mystic, right in the first couple of years, in the first 7 years until I had a car wreck. I became a triathlete. And to give you, at 18, 19, 20, 21, my 3-mile time was 20 minutes and 45 seconds. That is not a lot to write a home about, but I could do it in my sleep. You know what I mean? But then at 39, the fall off, at age 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, the fall off was only a 21-12, 21-13 was the, so that ain't bad. That's only about 20, 30 seconds of fall off, for being like 20 years, almost 20 years older.
So how do you understand most people? They would rather do all these things with a group, right? People would rather go to yoga with a group, would rather run with a group, would rather walk with a group, would rather go bowling with a group, but you would prefer to bowl alone. So how do you understand other people and yourself? With most people prefer to bowl together, you prefer to bowl alone. How do you understand that?
I mean, if the people are cool, I bowl with them. I bowl with them. Most people are squares, though, Luke. And you just have to know where I live. I live at the school where Rebecca Lobach was trained. We got 1,500 Rebecca Lobachs running around. I was at the lake. This will tell you the state of things between men and women these days. I was at the lake on Monday walking the dogs, and I stopped counting once I got to 40 hard body women sitting out on towels. There's a swimming platform out in the middle of the lake. There was about 15 of them on it. There was women everywhere. There wasn't a swinging dick at the lake nowhere. Now, I think back to like yours and my time, Luke. I don't care. There would have been some dudes throwing footballs, trying to like start small chats. These are girls in bikinis, and I wonder what's changed. And I was thinking to myself, where are all the dudes? Why is there 40-something women here and no dudes? And they were spread out everywhere across the lake. It was the craziest thing. But that's the state of things. And that's really what I want to leave you with, is that not we hadn't had to start locking our doors since 1965, these last 60 years. And Rebecca Lobach's and everything, NAFTA and these open borders, and not just here, to every country in the West. It makes a lot of sense, if you realize what I'm telling you, that there's a priesthood above what you think everybody thinks. Queen Elizabeth or King Charles, whatever the fuck he's called, he's in charge, or Donald Trump's in charge. I'll leave you with this. You remember when William the Conqueror was chilling with his buddies down in Normandy, France, and he got a call from somebody, probably a banker, probably in the city of London, who said, "Hey, we'll give you a bunch of gold and a bunch of land if you come up here and conquer these Saxons. They're not giving us enough tax money," or whatever the reason was. William and his buddies went right up there through England and conquered everything. Now, you and me, Luke, if it had been just a normal, straight up, above the board conquering, we would have went into the city of London. That's where all the gold is. That's where all the riches was. Hell no. William the Conqueror stopped right there, just outside that 1.12 square miles of the city of London. And he said, "I'll reign sovereign over this land." And that's why to this day, King Charles, if they don't want him there, he ain't got no right in the city of London. So who fucking runs this world? Is it the King Charles and the Donald Trumps, or the people who paid the sack of gold to William the Conqueror to go take over everything but the city of London?
The situation runs the world. Sometimes it's the plumber. Sometimes it's the banker. Sometimes it's the novelist. It depends on the situation, right? There is no class of people who are impervious to the power of the situation. Everybody must bow before the situation. All hail the situation.
10-4, buddy. I'll talk to you next
bro.
week.
Take care, bro. Bye. Sounds good. Bye.
Rationalize some of the things that he did, or some of the behavior you saw, or some of the public outer-facing concerns that people had with him. But look, there were people like Peter Baker at the times who were doing stuff who were reporting on this, at least trying. And
barely. He barely tried. He barely tried.
Andy Linsky did.
Andy Linsky's there's amongst a few. All right, here's another one. This is an NBC story, and this one, number 16. This goes to one of my favorite / least favorite ways the press engaged in the cover-up, which is once MSNBC put a doctor on, I don't know if you guys remember this, they put a doctor on who actually said he had huge concerns about Biden's mental acuity. That guy was then disappeared. Yep. But what they would do is they would not, if I'd been covering the White House, I would have shut the place down and said, where's the president's doctor? How could the president not be being tested? So here's an NBC headline of this genre. As Biden's memory issues draw attention, neurologists weigh in. Forgetting the names of acquaintances, having difficulty remembering dates from the past doesn't affect decision-making or judgment, brain experts say. Drew, what do you think? And what do you think when you see that?
Yeah, well, so a little context before we dive into the piece. So this came out right after the Hur report came out in February.
Okay, so occasionally the truth broke through in the mainstream media.
To talk more about those 8 White House visits by the Parkinson's expert, I'm joined tonight by Dr. Tom Pitts. He's a quadruple board-certified neurologist. He sees patients with Parkinson's all the time. He diagnoses it. I want to be completely transparent here. You've never examined President Biden. From my knowledge, you've never even spoken yet to President Biden.
Been in the same room as
and we're just going to use what we have so far, which is what we've seen, the president's interviews, and the information coming out of the White House. So my first question to you is, as somebody who's a neurologist, what you've seen from the president over the last 2 years, what you saw at the debate, the last few interviews, the way he speaks, the way maybe he walks. Have you noticed anything that gives you a red flag as a doctor?
Oh, yeah. I see him 20 times a day in clinic. I mean, it's ironic because he has just such classic features of neurodegeneration. I mean, word finding difficulties, and that's not, I couldn't find the word. That's from degeneration of the word retrieval area.
He's also overcome stuttering, though. Could that be part of that, too?
No, this is not a palatal issue or a speech discrepancy, which is very different from a lemino dysfunction, actual word retrieval, where you pick a similar question.
Right. The elite news media never had this neurologist back, right? They didn't want to hear these basic, plain truths.
Question or talk around the issue, plus the
right. So what you find with the news is that they very quickly arrive at a certain narrative, and if you differ from the narrative, they have no use for you.
Rigidity, monotone voice.
Wait, go back to that, the rigidity. What do you mean?
Rigidity, loss of arm swing, standing up lordotically. You notice when he turns, it's kind of en bloc turning. It's not a quick turn. So that's one of the hallmarks of Parkinson's is rigidity and bradykinesia, slow movement. And he has that hallmark, especially with the low voice that said was a cold, hypophonia.
Right. You would think that if the news media was interested in truth on this story, they would have this guy back again and again. Right. He's obviously onto something. But there was a blackout of this guy ever appearing again in the elite news media.
A small monotone voice like this over time is a hallmark of Parkinsonism. I could have diagnosed him from across the mall.
Here are some of the symptoms from Parkinson's. We just had him up there on the screen if we can put him back. What about the movement? Some people have pointed out the way he walks sometimes. It's not very fast, small steps. Is that something that is common in people who are battling a disease like Parkinson's?
Yeah, it's a hallmark. Shuffling gait, we call that, so little steps. Loss of arm swing from the rigidity. When we walk, we have a nice cadence. You notice he doesn't really swing his arms. And en bloc turning, meaning he kind of pivots around his foot. If you said, hey, President Biden, he wouldn't go like this. So, yeah,
but I also know, tell me if I'm wrong here, it's very hard to diagnose Parkinson's, isn't it? It's not simple. I mean, I've heard that it can be.
It's one of the easier movement disorders to diagnose, actually.
Right.
But it's so clinic. There's very little other. And I'm a Democrat. I always say about this.
Right.
It's just like this guy is not a hard case.
But I've had relatives who have gone through neurological issues, and I've heard that sometimes Parkinson's is not very easy to nail. You have to take a lot of tests.
See how desperate this NBC News anchor is to try to discredit this doctor. Right. This doctor knows 1,500 times more about this particular topic than the anchor. But the anchor is incredibly invested in discrediting him.
It's early on. If you're just presented with like hallucinations, that could be a variety of things, or just the cognitive problems. That could be Alzheimer's versus Parkinsonism, and that becomes a little nebulous. But once you start manifesting the hallmark motor symptoms, slow movement, rigidity, mass facies, hypophonia. I mean, if a med student did not pick Parkinson's on the test, they'd be remediated.
So let me ask you, if you had, and I know you can't. You have no idea what happened in the White House, but a neurologist coming 8 times in 8 months, does that tell you anything? Is that? I mean, I know you're just sort of speculating here, but does that tell you anything or no?
Well, I mean, I don't know if they're like the best of friends or something, but that's a very specific, he's a movement disorder. That's a subspecialist in exactly what he has. And there's very few young people, like a Marine Guard. Most people would be med boarded out for any type of movement disorder at a young age. Like if you had Huntington's chorea, early onset Parkinson's, dystonia, bad essential tremor, you're usually med boarded out. So I highly doubt there's...
What does that mean, med boarded out?
Med boarded mean the military would not let you, if you have seizures, for example, you cannot usually be in the military. That is, you are
so
medical boarded out.
You're saying you don't necessarily believe, and they're not saying this, but they said there's thousands of military members that go to the White House that are treated there for health reasons. Yeah. You're not buying that that's a random military person.
No, that would be very odd to just see a random movement disorder case at the White House, especially a young guard. There aren't many young people that have movement disorders that could be in the military.
And then, a lot of people have called for a cognitive test. What exactly would that entail? What does that mean?
Now, that's the key, because word finding, retrieval, doesn't necessarily mean you don't know what you want to say. What I cannot comment on is his ability to make good decisions. His motor symptoms are degenerating. He has Parkinsonism. That is a fact. He has degeneration of the brain. Show me the MRI. Show me he doesn't. Put your money where your mouth is. He definitely has it. But the problem is, when you look at his situation, you can't say, I know for a fact that because he didn't retrieve the word, he didn't know what he wanted to say. And that's why both him and Trump should take the 4-hour neuropsychological testing, which is the hallmark test for cognitive.
February of 2024, where the special counsel who had been talking to Biden about his documents mishandling allegations from the time had described him in a report as an old man who wouldn't actually be able to stand trial because people wouldn't take him seriously, and that there were real concerns about his kind of mental acuity, about his memory, and all of these sorts of issues. And so you saw immediately after, this is the day of and the day after, the press was littered with experts, nameless experts, at least in headlines, saying, it's more complicated than that. The New York Times has this really outlandish kind of report about how we need more evidence to be able to draw conclusions about someone's mental acuity and mental state. We need real tests to be done on this, to say nothing of the fact that the Biden White House addressing these concerns hadn't actually pursued any of those tests, right? And so you have the media, I think in a lot of cases around this report, deliberately obfuscating the actual news, right? The news was this report. The media's take on it wasn't to talk about a specific thing. It was, it's a lot messier than this, and you don't quite understand. We need the experts to help you here. And I think you're right, Mark. One of the things that I think always tips me off to, what the media is saying here might not actually be valid is they're hiding behind experts to make a claim or an allegation.
Right.
And so in this case, brain experts. I mean, I've talked to many a brain expert in my own life. I don't think that brain experts walk around to ordinarily just help the media. I think they were probably selected to give evasive lines.
Right. All right. 2 more, 17 and then put up 18. Just 17, leave it up for a bit, and then 18. So there was a period when these Washington Post, cheap fake videos enrapture right-wing media, but deeply mislead. Deeply mislead. So it's true that in some instances, the right did something they shouldn't have done. They made videos of Biden look worse than they were. How Republicans use misleading videos to attack Biden in a 24-hour period. So they put a lot of effort in the media doing a quasi-investigative work on how Republicans were doing something they shouldn't have done. And they set the cause back. You didn't need to doctor these videos or slow them down or add funny music to them. They spoke for themselves. But this created the permission structure for the media to say, there's nothing to see here, because anything you're seeing with your own eyes related to Joe Biden's loss of mental acuity is a Republican trick. Republican trick. So, Michael, these stories were pushed by the Democrats. The press did not on their own. So I just ask you again, to the extent you can speak to this either with information or just knowing how things work. They knew Biden had a loss of mental acuity. They knew that these videos gave them an opening to pretend that the issue was not Biden's loss of mental acuity, but Republicans doing something misleading. How did those conversations take place? How do they have the nerve to call reporters and pitch this? How does that work?
Well, there's a lot of assumptions here, and I don't ever make excuses or do much defending of the Biden PR shop. And look, I was one of the few people who always advocated, and I was attacked for this, but always advocated for him to show, not tell. So for every bad moment he has, he should be out there 25 times more. Right? To show, not tell. Now, what they did here, I mean, look, they punish reporters. They threaten access. I was booked 45 times in 2023 on CNN, and the White House pressured CNN not to ever have me on again after the turn of the year. And I've experienced this stuff now.
You just to be clear, you used to work for Jill Biden. After you left the White House, you were a regular on CNN.
So whenever you hear someone say, I don't want to make excuses, or I don't want to obfuscate, all right, that's exactly what they're going to be doing.
CNN. The White House decided they didn't want you on television anymore. So they told CNN, basically, don't put this guy on anymore.
Yeah, and they threatened CNN with access, and
Yeah.
I was noted in their guest tracking system. So whenever somebody would want to book me, they would see a note or a flag. You have to call it Y and Z. Look, and I had never experienced the media like that before until this election cycle, and that's how my personal views about everything in the media and Democrats have somewhat shifted, and it's cost me a lot of friends because I've been as outspoken as I am. But
but I know you said, sorry to interrupt, but I know you said I was just making a lot of assumptions. But let me lay out the chain here.
Okay.
Joe Biden had a loss of mental acuity that was obvious to anyone with a C-SPAN subscription. Okay, the people in the White House knew that. They might have convinced themselves it wasn't as bad, and he did have good moments. So but they also knew he had bad moments. They knew that he once addressed a dead congresswoman who he knew was dead, but spoke to her as if she was in the room. So they know he has a problem. They know that winning the election before he withdrew as a nominee depended to a not significant extent on keeping that conversation from growing, even though polls showed 70% or something of Americans thought he didn't have the acuity. So they needed to, that was their big vulnerability. He wasn't stepping aside. So they knew their job was to minimize conversations about this topic. And so they did things like when they saw an opening to say, well, Republicans have overstepped their bounds because they've doctored some of these videos. Not all of them, but some of them. So what I'm saying is, if you know he's got a loss of mental acuity, they did. If you know winning the White House back and stopping Trump depends to a large extent on keeping that conversation from coming to a head. And then you say, well, we know the press will side with us if we give them the opportunity to side with us. So here's an opportunity to say, hey, press, you don't need to cover Joe Biden's loss of mental acuity. You can cover this sexy concept of deep fakes.
Well,
deep fakes. So do they sit at a meeting and say to each other, here's our opening. Let's pitch this concept of cheap fakes because this will change the subject, or they wouldn't discuss that amongst themselves?
No, they would. They absolutely would.
Yeah.
And they would probably signal a campaign. And there are a core group of attack dogs that were on the campaign and a core group in lower press at the White House. And look, we use Signal every day. We were encouraged to use Signal. The entire White House and our campaigns operated on Signal. So I'm sure they all use Signal to talk about how they were going to coordinate. And also, that would have, going out and finding these medical experts would have been something shiny and new to give the press to, not advance the story, but turn it in a different direction.
Did government officials in the Biden administration use Signal but not document, back up the official government records?
It's a great question. I have no idea why nobody has ever asked the question because all of our we weren't allowed to text message. And whenever we were texting with reporters, we had to save and turn those in, just like our physical notes. I'm surprised nobody has asked to see the Biden archives records on all the Signal things.
So Drew, I consider the New York Times and the Washington Post to be the biggest offenders based on their influence. Let's say the New York Times watches tonight's episode, and there are people at the paper who watch, and they said, "Oh my God, we do have a credibility problem with America." Yep. Drew, we're hiring you as a consultant. We're paying you $50,000 a month, which is what Hunter got from.
I was going to say Hunter money
from Burisma. $50,000 a month. Tell us what to do. Tell us how we can conduct ourselves on this story. Do we need to write a 5-part series? Do we need some sort of note from the publisher? They say, Drew, we will do what you think is right to restore our credibility on this story. What would you recommend?
There was a series of essays and pieces called "The Press versus the President" that you may very well be familiar with after the Russian collusion conversation died down, where a number of journalists went on the record and basically said, hey, we got this wrong. We got this wrong because of our biases and our blind spots and what have you. I think if the legacy media institutions like the New York Times and the Washington Post, if they really wanted to restore credibility, they would go through these pieces. That Washington Post piece we talked about, which I will also add, one of their explanations for why we knew these videos weren't legit was because Biden, quote, has said he doesn't dance. They would go back through these pieces and they would add detailed editor's notes about what we know now, what we should have known then, and then they would publicize those. They would go back and the Washington Post, to their credit, did this after the Russia stuff. They went back and they added detailed author's notes and they wrote stories about their author's notes. So I think step one would be doing that and going back and saying not just, hey, oh yeah, we should have done this thing and we didn't. We deliberately avoided this conversation and we contributed to suppressing it. That would be one.
How do you prove that?
Sorry, how do you prove that?
How would the Washington Post or the New York Times prove that happened? Would they interview their own reporters to say, what was your mindset, editors?
I mean, it seems like one of the conversations that I think was had at the White House Correspondents' Center and other places was the knowledge that these conversations were happening off the record with the Biden administration, right? And that they knew about these things and didn't say them. And so, fine, if you want to leave aside the deliberate cover-up, I think there has to at least be an acknowledgement that what we did, the way we chose to cover this story, effectuated a cover-up of these details. And it wasn't just that we missed it and we didn't see it. It's that we took efforts that ran counter to the thing that we knew was true. That would be step one.
Yeah.
Step two, and I know that this was a big thing back in 2016, would be to actually try and change your newsrooms, right? I think one of the reasons why this is such a problem, and Mark, you and I have talked about this before, is that there is no intellectual diversity in so many of these newsrooms. At least not insofar as there's someone who can put up a hand and say, actually, I don't think that's quite true, or I don't think this is the accurate framing when we talk about Biden and his cognitive capabilities. And so I think if they really wanted to make an effort to win back the American people, they should make a committed effort to get, and it doesn't have to be conservatives, right? It doesn't have to be people who agree or pro-Trump or whatever. It has to be people who are genuinely open-minded, and they have to be.
One of my favorite podcasts is on the left is called If Books Could Kill, and they take on airport bestsellers, and they did one episode on the Josh Hawley book on manhood. Senator Josh
Yeah,
Hawley.
what do we have, Peter? I guess I could say, what do you know about manhood? Maybe that's a longer answer. What do you know about your own, Peter, and others, and that of others? Or I could say, what do you know about Josh Hawley?
Yeah.
I was going to challenge you to describe him without using the phrase evil twink.
I still remember that video of him jogging away on January 6th.
His little legs.
He's got like a runner's stride, just hauling ass away from the rioters, to then turn around and be like, you know what's missing?
I know.
Masculinity.
Whatever. You guys are pussies.
Pussy.
Too many pussies out here. We need more real men like me.
Yeah.
I'm afraid.
All right. I think I have it.
You have one? Okay. Peter.
Michael.
What do you know about Manhood by Josh Hawley?
All I know is that when I want to learn about masculinity, I go to an effete man best known for being a coward.
There's nothing unmanly about running away when that's the best choice, right? It's suicidal to try to take on a mob by yourself. All right, you're a United States Senator or you're in a position of peril. Frequently, the best thing to do is to run away. And so just mocking him for that, all right, I don't find impressive. Right? Find amusing. I get the amusing, but not impressive.
Bombastic. Likes to just do culture war bullshit for attention.
Yeah.
You know, grandstands about like.
Okay, so what's culture war bullshit to these guys and grandstanding is speaking to the issues that motivate the traditional side of America. Josh Hawley articulately speaks up for traditional values. If you don't share traditional values, then you're not going to resonate. But for these guys, they're unable to consider that different people not only have different gifts, but they have different hero systems. So what is of salient interest to the two left-wing hosts of this show is not a salient interest to me. Why? It's not because I'm better or worse than they are. I just have a different hero system. Depending on your hero system, right, different things will be important. So freedom of 12-year-olds to take beta blockers or hormones that prevent you from going through puberty blockers, all right? The freedom for kids to take puberty blockers and enjoy gender-affirming care is a supreme value for many people on the left. For people who are not on the left, this is gross, awful dereliction of duty of society to allow children to maim themselves this way is just a horror. So whether you think gender-affirming care, which will produce a lifelong series of profits for medical centers, right, that get kids to take puberty blockers, right, they are then put into a lifelong needing for very expensive medical care. It makes them great customers. So depending on your hero system, children taking puberty blockers is a wonderful thing or a terrible thing. From the perspective of my hero system, it is a terrible thing. From the perspective of the hosts of this show, right, giving children the right to do this is a heroic thing.
Trans people and shit like that. Very, very fundamentally slimy.
Yeah, the word I kept thinking was worm.
Worm-like in soul.
So, incredibly narrow perspective. All right, I think it's slimy and worm-like and disgusting to encourage children to mutilate and maim themselves and to take puberty blockers. But I don't have the delusion that that is just the universal objective nature of reality. It's just my particular hero system, which is different from the host. They just cannot seem to conceive that different people have different hero systems. And it doesn't make you less of a man to have a different hero system from these left-wing hosts.
And appearance.
But speaking of grandstanding, Peter, I wanted to start with sort of how Hawley became the manhood Republican and sort of, I think, really launched this narrative that Reeves repeats a lot in his book, too, that, Republicans are the ones who are taking care of men. Republicans care about men, and liberals are all effeminate.
Well, men do feel much more at ease with Republicans and with conservatives and with a traditional perspective on life. Right? Men are much more at ease with hierarchy, with having skepticism about strangers, with harshly punishing people who do terrible things, while women tend towards a much more nurturing and left-of-center politics.
And don't care and just look down upon men.
Half right.
Yeah. And the way that Josh Hawley has done this is he started with a speech in 2021 where he basically laid out the case for we need to bring back manhood. Manhood is under attack, blah, blah, blah. And then he follows it up with the book. But I want to start with a couple of excerpts from the speech because this is really like the first most Americans heard about like him branding himself as like the protector of American masculinity. So I'm sending you a clip.
But what I want you to notice, what I want to call out tonight is that the deconstruction of America begins with and depends on the deconstruction of American men.
So, $10 super chat. Thank you, Party Bots. Appreciate your support of the show. So, but people on the right, people who are traditional, they believe that sex is something overwhelmingly biological. And that is the biological truth of sex. But for people on the left, they think that sex is gender, which is something that is socially constructed. Now, from a biological perspective, sex is overwhelmingly something that is just inherent in our chromosomes, and it is impossible to change your sex. All you can do is mutilate and maim yourself.
How shiny he is.
The left want to define traditional masculinity as toxic. They want to define the
So people on the right believe that sex is in our chromosomes, that it is biological, and that these genetic differences and cultural differences and the recognition that different groups have different gifts, including the group of men and the group of women. All right, this recognition and ease with difference and varying forms of hierarchy, right, is much more of a hallmark of the right than the left, which doesn't make it correct. But the hosts don't seem to understand that they come from a particular hero system, just like Josh Hawley comes from a particular hero system. Right. None of us are seeing these things objectively.
traditional masculine virtues, things like courage and independence and assertiveness as a danger to society.
Yeah. We hate those.
This is an effort that the left has been at for years now, and they have had alarming success.
We've destroyed men.
American men are working less. They're getting married in fewer numbers. They're fathering fewer children.
So people on the right are much more at ease with men having male-only spaces. Right. Overwhelmingly, the center, the elites, and the left have wanted to wage war on male-only spaces. One example of that is the New York Times, for something like 28 days in a row, ran a front-page story on the Augusta golf course that hosts the Masters, how it has a men's-only club, and they wanted to destroy that club. All right, you belong to a male-only organization, and the elites, the news media, will often find a way to hurt you for it. Right, you really don't want to be part of an explicitly male-only group if you're looking out for your best interests. An officially male-only group, right? Be part of an unofficial group that doesn't have explicit legal standing and rules, right? You'll be much less vulnerable. You'll be much less fragile.
Love it.
They're suffering more anxiety and depression.
Sweater polos.
They're engaging in more substance abuse.
Okay.
Many men in this country are in crisis. And
it is breathtaking, the lack of awareness that these two left-wing hosts have, that different people not just see the world differently, but experience the world differently, have different genetic, psychological, environmental, right, predispositions.
their ranks are swelling.
Swelling.
And that's not just a crisis for men.
Yeah, the gay guy wants to get off on the word swelling.
That's a crisis for the American Republic.
So I don't think it's an absurd position to recognize that men are having some problems right now, just as women are having some problems, and that the problems that face Jews or face blacks or face men or face women or face Mexican Americans are often different, right? No group is without its problems. What is so awful about having some sensitivity to the problems of men or of white people or of Jews or of Christians?
We're going to watch another clip, but intermediate thoughts, intermission thoughts, Peter.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things that I hate the most is courage.
Yep.
I don't like seeing it. I don't like hearing about it.
When men are like, I'll shovel the driveway, we're like, fuck you. Yeah. That's the patriarchy right there.
Okay, this is good. All right, this is good. It's good to get a left-wing perspective sometimes because you forget how blinkered your own side can be. You forget how absurd and ridiculous and petty and partisan and pointless many right-wing critiques are. So here I 100% agree with the two left-wing hosts in mocking the assumption that courage is something that the left reviles.
And my cat jumps on the counter, even though I always yell at her. Toxic masculinity.
Okay, clip 2.
Let me just start by pressing home this point to you, that the left's attack on America leads directly to an attack on men. For years now, Democrats and other leftists have insisted that America is systemically oppressive and unjust. They've said it so much and so often, to them, it's a truism.
They say it so much they think it's true.
Joe Biden has, as president, repeatedly decried America's systemic racism. His administration has loudly called for a new gender equity agenda to right the structural injustices of our society.
I think there's injustice.
His nominees have advocated critical race theory and training in equity for federal workers. This past week, the administration celebrated the introduction of an X gender marker on American passports. Did you see this?
Unbelievable.
X meaning neither male nor female, just so you're keeping up.
Pick one.
All of this points to how important the deconstructionist agenda is for Team Biden and for the American left.
The left.
I mean, you think about it. Inflation may be rampant. Store shelves are bare. It costs $100 to fill up a minivan in America. But the administration will not be deterred from focusing on the important issues. They are laser focused on exposing just how bad America is. Other prominent liberals have taken this the next step and identified America's many alleged woes.
Okay, this is an important issue depending on your hero system. If it's not an important issue to you, it doesn't make you inherently superior. It just means that you value different things.
With men in particular. Take Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez.
Boo. Boo. I knew they'd be booing.
White supremacy and patriarchy are linked in a lot of ways, she says. Meaning that America's systemic racism is a systemic problem with men.
You're racist if you have courage.
Author John Stoltenberg writes that talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. Professor Susanna Walters of Northeastern University says it seems logical to hate men.
So if you are an elite, if you're a professional, right, if you have status, it's simply low status to talk about the problems of white people or the problems of men or the problems of Christians, right? United States, I agree with Aaron Wren, until about 1992 was predominantly a pro-Christian country. Between 1992 and the Obergefell ruling in 2015, it was a neutral country with regard to Christianity. But since 2015, the United States has increasingly become an anti-Christian country. And the United States has, in some areas, become an increasingly anti-white country, an anti-male country. Just as in other areas of the United States, it's anti-black and anti-women, right? Every group has plenty of reasons to feel victimized.
Unless they pledge to vote for feminist women only and don't run for office.
I love, I found some fucking professor somewhere who ran their mouth a little bit.
Who said something I disagree with, basically.
Also, it's been decades since it cost $100 to fill up a minivan with what I imagine is groceries. What are you talking about?
You mean filling it with eggs? He's talking about filling it with eggs.
I think they just sort of pull together these things that make it seem as if there's a really coherent point. But what does gender markers on passports have to do with your point?
The coherence of his point fits for people who share his value system. If you don't share his value system, then his points aren't going to cohere. They're not going to cohere from the perspective of your left-wing, secular, post-Enlightenment worldview.
Exactly. How is the average man being undermined in their ability to express themselves?
This is also what really frustrates me is people like...
How is the average man being undermined in his ability to express themselves? Well, for one thing, the Barack Obama administration made it impossible to have due process for men accused of sexual misbehavior on college campuses. So that's something that affects thousands of men. The increasing HRification of American society has made it virtually impossible for men to express themselves and to be treated fairly. right? HR departments are overwhelmingly run by women, overwhelmingly for the advantage of women and for the disadvantage of men. Women can dress in sexually provocative outfits, come to work in a sexually provocative outfit, and if the man comments on it, he's the one who's busted, right? The woman who is sexually provoking through her choice of outfits, right? She's not going to get a dress down from the HR department in all likelihood. So there are other ways where women can point out how they are experiencing discrimination or difficulty or unfairness, right? I don't deny that there are groups aside from men and aside from Christians and aside from traditionalists and conservatives who suffer, right? All groups suffer in different situations. What I am reacting against is the smug assurance of these two left-wing co-hosts that people with a different hero system cannot cohere.
Richard Reeves, who I think are trying to have a good faith conversation about this, kind of talk around the fact that the vast majority of people who bring this up constantly are having a bad faith conversation.
So a good faith conversation means to essentially accept the foundational principles of these two left-wingers and their hero system. And people on the right are just as guilty of complaining about a lack of a good faith conversation. Usually good faith conversation means that you don't offend my hero system. Right? There's nothing objectively good faith about that. So people on all sides of the spectrum tend to misuse good faith conversation. Right? The closest that I'm aware of to an ongoing good faith conversation occurs on Mark Halperin's morning and evening shows.
Conversation about this, right?
Yeah.
He brings up all these ways in which like men are struggling, marriage rates are falling, men don't earn as much money as they used to. Real things, fine, like complicated societal phenomena that we can discuss. And then he immediately goes to these just like podunk examples of like a gender studies professor.
Okay, it's podunk if you have this secular liberal hero system. If you have a traditional hero system, if you have a traditional Christian hero system, his examples cohere and make perfect sense. I can't believe how parochial and narrow and partisan these two hosts are being. You'd think they'd be a little bit more sophisticated and recognize that different groups experience the world differently and therefore have different hero systems.
This is based on a Washington Post op-ed where she's like, yeah, women are mad at men because like men do most of like the raping in society.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a particularly good op-ed, to be totally honest, and I don't totally agree with it, but it's just sort of like, yeah, it's an op-ed by a woman.
Yeah, men do most of the raping in society, and there are probably some areas of life where women do most of the bad things, right? Women probably do most of the effective lying, right, in marriages, for example. Women initiate most divorces, right? I would never argue that men or women are superior to each other, right? They have different gifts and different vulnerabilities.
And saying like when people say men are trash, this is like what they're expressing.
It's one lady who said something that you think is stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not indicative of some broad agenda or anything like that.
And there's also the other example that he cites here is there's this.
It depends on your hero system, right? You have a traditional hero system, you'll detect a frequently anti-male, anti-Christian, anti-white bias in many elite sectors of society that then filters down through HR departments and schools and corporations. And if you have a different hero system, you'll detect other forms of discrimination.
Author who says talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. It's just a random ass blog post by this random ass guy. And then the really bad one is he cites AOC saying white supremacy and patriarchy are linked in a lot of ways as like an example of how the left has gone too far. This is an interview with AOC talking about how she was afraid of getting raped on January 6th because she's a survivor of sexual assault.
Right.
And so she's like, yeah, the fact is these people are fucking psychos. And when people are psychos, they also act out in like violently gendered ways as well. So like, wow, yeah, you really got her on this one.
You just can't talk about sociology around Republicans. It makes them upset. Like the quote from her is
in chaotic, lawless environments, women have every rational reason to fear rape.
Most irrelevant to what he's talking about, really. He's just looking for those buzzwords, white supremacy, toxic masculinity, right? Like, he just wants to upset the audience, which is at, like, the National Conservative Conference.
And he's also kind of doing what she's talking about, right? He's talking about how men are under threat, and he also throws in, like, critical race theory.
Right.
In there, which has nothing to do with anything. It's like, oh, yeah, how dare she say that people who protect the interests of men also protect the interests of whites?
Yeah.
Literally what he's doing.
I wish that podcasting is a bad format for Hawley speak, because it really is important to just take a glance at him.
We can't get the moisture. I know you're not getting the glistening, just the shininess of this man.
He's a real slime boy.
So that was 2021. In 2023, he comes out with Manhood, the Masculine Virtues America Needs. which gets a lot of discourse. We are going to talk about the book in some detail. I said on the podcast that it was a rich text. I regret saying that. It's got a lot of filler. It's not like dense with meaning. We're going to talk about a couple of the highlights, but the vast majority of this book, honestly, is just really boring. It's a lot of like Bible verses and him just like telling Bible stories a lot.
This is what happens when you want to sell a bullshit book, but like you don't.
I can't think of many good books written by politicians. So I suspect that these two left-wing hosts are correct, that this book by Josh Hawley on manhood is not a great book, because politicians have to play it safe to stay in office, and playing it safe usually produces boring books.
Really have more than a long essay's worth, right?
So I am going to send you the thesis of the book.
All is not well with men in America, and that spells trouble for the American Republic. It has been a perennial question of political philosophy since the first republics were formed whether a free nation could survive without soundness of character in its people. The old-fashioned word for that is virtue, meaning not just moral uprightness, but the personal fortitude and vision such uprightness produces. Strength, in other words. Machiavelli called it virtù.
It's not well written. It's sort of overwritten and underwritten at the same time.
I like how he's like, it's virtue. Machiavelli called it virtue in Italian.
Well, which politician's a great writer? I guess Barack Obama is a great writer. He's not deep, he's not profound, but he is glib. And Kip notes that Patrice, the late comic, says men being forced to work with women who are dressing in a sexy way, they are like the grizzly bear being forced to work alongside a room full of salmon dipped in honey. Patrice had some common sense.
Practically everywhere one looks in America now, male virtue is crumbling, except he's doing the Italian virtue.
Yeah, male virtue.
And consequences for the country are grave. Crime is on the rise, overwhelmingly committed by men. Disinterest in work is becoming commonplace. And in perhaps the starkest example of male weakness, fatherlessness abounds. Doing like a crime on the rise thing in 2021, when crime's been rising for exactly 1 year, is pretty ballsy.
Yeah.
Crime on the rise.
Right, so these guys, like a lot of talking heads and a lot of elites in the media, they take for granted that national government statistics accurately reflect reality. When police are incentivized not to do their jobs, and as a result, people give up on reporting many crimes, you are going to have a drop in the reporting of some crimes. Right? That does not mean that we live in a safe, cohesive, coherent society. But they take it for granted that, these official government statistics, they must correlate with reality at close to 100%. So the official unemployment rate, it's about 4%. But in reality, 1/4 of working Americans are unable to work the number of hours that they need, that they want. Right? So in reality, our unemployment rate is much closer to 24% than 4%.
Disinterest in work, commonplace, fatherlessness abounds. One of those already solved.
Yeah.
So we're actually doing fantastic.
I also, the main reason I'm including this is just to point out the fact that he's essentially making the same case as Richard Reeves.
Uh-huh.
The case that Richard Reeves makes in his book has basically been workshopped by men's rights activists, and they always kind of cherry pick the same like 3 or 4 categories of things. As we've said, many of these things are real issues and should be like addressed and investigated, etc.
Yeah.
But it's like you really have to look for these specific ways in which men are falling behind women in America, and it's always the same like 4 things.
Right.
So he then goes through, I mean, I'm not going to do it, but he goes through like boys are falling behind in school, and then he follows up with a bit more analysis, which I'm sending to you.
Much has been said in recent years of the divisions in American society, the dangers to our democracy, and our growing polarization. Surely it is no coincidence that these ills have proliferated while American men have struggled. As the anthropologist David Gilmour once wrote, manhood is the social barrier that societies must erect against entropy, human enemies, the forces of nature, time, and all the human weaknesses that threaten social life. David Gilmour really running his mouth there.
Well, he does. He's making a factual error here. That's actually the lead singer of Pink Floyd. I don't know why he said it's an anthropologist. But what he's basically saying is, according to this anthropologist, manhood is our last bastion against chaos, right?
So good comment here in the chat. Isn't sex an objective reality? Well, part of determining reality is varying levels of importance. So if you believe in the buffered perspective on human identity, that through your own buffered power of your reasoning, you can detect the differences between right and wrong, you can determine what is right and wrong all on your own, that you can be autonomous and strategic as you plot your way through life, then you will recognize that, yes, there is a significant objective biological reality to sex, but you would see the more profound, the deeper, the most important truth is that you can essentially choose your sex and choose your gender. So it's not necessarily that it requires denying objective biological reality. It's that you would then say the biological reality is less important than the reality of the buffered Enlightenment, left-wing, rationalist, liberal perspective on self-consciousness, that with the power of our own reasoning, we can be strategic and autonomous in life and choose, therefore, what sexual identity we want to take on.
Need men to protect us from like these creeping social forces that want to tear us apart.
All of which, by the way, are other men.
Yeah.
Men keep crime at bay and also are the primary perpetrators
are the people doing
crime.
the criming.
He has to say that it's a barrier against human enemies. Because
yeah, so if you're walking down the street and you see men in the company of women, right, they're unlikely to be violent. They're unlikely to rob and rape you. Right? Men around women tend to behave much more decently than packs of young men on their own.
If you just said enemies, you'd...
Also, you see someone walking down the street in a relaxed fashion, they're much less likely to be a threat. To hurt people, to rob people, to rape people, to torture people, you have to tense, right? You have to get into fight or flight, right? There's all sorts of muscular tension and contraction and weird interfering muscular tension patterns that will ripple across your visage if you are aware of what's going on. So you see someone in fight or flight, someone locked down, locked in with weird interfering tension patterns, they're much more likely to be explosive than someone such as myself who is at ease and has some upward direction operating and is not pulling down and in on himself.
Probably be thinking men.
So he mentions this David Gilmour guy, and he has this quote, which really sounds like a defense of manhood, right? Like, we need men, right? I was like, okay, who's this David Gilmour guy? Where is this quote from? This is from a book called Manhood in the Making, which I bought and started reading. I was like, oh, I should read like the introduction to this. Like, what is this anthropologist saying about manhood? It's basically a survey of like the way that manhood is socially constructed around the world. And it's fascinating. And I sat there and read the book all day. We're going to talk about this for like 45 minutes, Peter. I don't care if you're interested or not. You can just sit silently. I'm going. This stuff is so fucking interesting to me. So basically what he finds is that it's remarkably common and consistent that societies have this like very socially constructed and socially enforced notion of manhood, and especially rituals associated with becoming a man. Mm-hmm. So this thing of like, Jewish people have like bar mitzvahs, this sort of like a symbolic way of showing like you're no longer.
So I just asked Grok, what are the most important differences between the political right and the political left on male-female differences? So first important difference is biological versus social. So the right emphasizes biological differences, genetics, hormones, not just in differences between men and women, but differences between various groups. As primary drivers of male-female traits, behaviors, and roles, the right is more likely to cite evolutionary psychology. They'll discuss men's greater physical strength or women's nurturing tendencies and will argue for innate distinctions. The left will stress the social and the cultural factors, socialization, systemic biases as shaping most differences. The left will view trait differences between men and women as socially constructed rather than inherent and biological, and the left will tend to downplay or question biological determinism. So sex and gender roles, the right will tend to support traditional gender sex roles. I hate the term gender, right, as a substitute for the more accurate word sex. So the right will argue that different sex roles reflect natural differences and complementary functions men provide, women take care. The right will see deviations as potentially disruptive to social stability. The left will advocate for fluid and egalitarian roles. The left will argue that traditional norms stem from patriarchal structures. The left will promote dismantling patriarchal structures and rigid expectations to allow for more individual choice, particularly with regard to sexual matters. The right will accept studies showing differences between men and women in their thinking, that men have an edge in spatial reasoning, women in verbal skills. The right will see this as evidence of inherent biological objective reality and will justify different treatment or expectations based on these realities. The left is skeptical of these studies, will cite methodological flaws or small effect sizes, will argue for the overwhelming importance of society and the environment, such as education and stereotypes, to largely explain observed differences, and will advocate for equal treatment. Policy implications. The right supports policies reflecting perceived differences, such as sex-specific sports or workplace roles, arguing for fairness and efficiency, will likely oppose affirmative action or quotas as ignoring natural disparities. The left will push for policies to counteract what they see as historical inequities, such as gender-neutral sports categories, workplace diversity. They will argue against socially imposed systemic barriers. They will say that it's not biology, it is society that's creating these disparities, and so it is society that can remove the disparities.
For a boy, you're becoming a man. This is like remarkably consistent.
I'm a little upset that you just said that to me like I might not know what a bar mitzvah is.
Well, am I talking to you or am I talking to listeners? I don't know.
Are you talking to me or our incredibly anti-Semitic listeners?
So he profiles an East African tribe where boys get circumcised at age like 13, 14, and part of the ritual is you can't change your facial expression. So you're considered less of a man if you sort of react to pain.
By the way, I use that same analysis with babies who get circumcised.
He notes that like even in kind of non-violent societies, like societies that don't do a lot of warring with other groups, you still find these like pretty brutal rituals associated with becoming a man.
So this is an incredibly entertaining and left-wing podcast. It's fun at times to listen to different perspectives.
The Kalahari Bushmen, they make you like track an antelope, which involves like running and like, you know, it takes days to do this. And like, it's a real feat of endurance.
Yeah.
He has a really interesting section on the practices in Victorian England. They would send off their boys to these boarding schools. And the fact that the boarding schools were cruel were kind of part of the point. It's partly the parents being like, oh, he has to become a man. Like he has to face adversity to become a man. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes these masculinity norms involve a lot of risk taking. So he profiles the South Pacific Islands called the Truck Islands, where you're supposed to do these like deep sea fishing expeditions where people die constantly. It's like really dangerous. But if you don't want to do them or if you refuse to do them, everybody basically just says you're a pussy.
That's what they say about podcasting too. And has it stopped us?
I mean, he profiles probably like 25 or 30 different societies. He goes kind of like region by region. And what he finds is that in almost every society, manhood understandings are marked by this need for constant renewal. He says, although the stressed or embattled quality varies in intensity, true manhood frequently shows an inner insecurity that needs dramatic proof. Its vindication is doubtful, resting on rigid codes of decisive action in many spheres of life. As husband, father, lover, provider, warrior. A restricted status. There are always men who fail the test. These are the negative examples, held up scornfully to inspire conformity to the glorious ideal. So this thing of like American manhood that's like kind of constantly being redefined, and it's like a little fake, and it feels kind of ad hoc, and it feels like they're making it up on the fly. That's actually like very common. That like every society is just like, I know it when I see it. But he profiles this guy in southern Spain, which is like very traditional, very Catholic, where basically everyone thinks this guy is like a huge pussy because like he loves his wife and like he stays home with his wife and like helps her cook.
Yeah, it's gay. It's gay to love your wife. There's no question.
He also says like manhood myths and manhood social constructions are oftentimes totally contradictory. So it's like people expect this guy to be the strong, silent type. But the fact that he's introverted is a knock against his masculinity, right? And it's seen as a huge threat to his masculinity that he helps his wife cook. Specifically, it's like, oh my God, you're helping in the kitchen, you fucking loser. But also, if he cooks professionally, that's like not considered a threat to masculinity. Because like, oh, you're doing it as a professional.
Yeah, because then you're doing it for pussy. Then chicks like that.
Okay, that's it for now. I'll talk to you later. How has my personal relationship with Grok held up since the initial infatuation? I still love Grok. I'm surprised by the number of errors. When Grok cites an academic paper, so the Journal of Social Psychology published in the May 1991 issue the following article, I usually found that there was no such article. So I notice many factual errors, but when I have an intellectual fixation that just overtakes me, right, just overpowers me, and I have the time to indulge it, then I will jump onto Grok and just indulge my intellectual fixation for as long as I have the time. When I'm busy, and during Passover, when I was much more social, then I didn't get to indulge my AI fixation. But it is a wonderful resource, and just because it's flawed doesn't mean that it's not fascinating and valuable to delve into. Okay, what's going on here with UCLA? All right, I was at UCLA. I want to see this.
To be held accountable. And I think they will make it public. I mean, when you see these cabinet meetings, I think they will make all this stuff public. Natalie Beisner, Jason Rantz, thank you both.
Go. Yo! Give me my swag!
No place for you. No place for you. This is for you.
A Jewish student at UCLA saying and then showing that he was the victim of an anti-Semitic attack and had his Israeli flag stolen by pro-Palestinian protesters on campus last night. Let's bring in Eli Civis. Eli, I want you, we're going to play the video, and I just want you to tell me kind of what happened. You went onto the campus of UCLA. Tell me what happened as we play this video behind you.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have to understand, SJP is a club that was banned by Chancellor Frank's administration. Right. They still decided to hold a movie night that they were not allowed to hold. So UCPD came to disperse them. Now SJP decided to move locations. They went up to the residential area where UCLA students live. They continued to do their movie night, to protest. Now, at this point, I came and I had my Israeli flag, not to provoke them, but to show, like I always do other Jewish students, that there is no need to be afraid of these protesters. Now, one protester grabbed my flag and ran away. I went after them to retrieve my flag, and then around 6, 7, 8 of them circled around me and started throwing punches. One person tried to put me in a headlock. And this shows something, Trace. This shows what we've always known, you and I, for the last year and a half, that these protesters are violent. Anyone who claims that they're peaceful is delusional.
We've seen it. We've seen it again and again. I had you on March 6th, Eli, and you said this, and it's important I play this, gives us context. Watch.
We need to teach these students a lesson, and the only way to do that is with strict force. If you break a law, you get in trouble for it. The police
Okay,
you away.
Put it high
if you break a school rule, you get expelled. That is the only way these students will learn.
Two things changed. One, your hair was longer there. And two, Eli, the truth is it looks like UCLA was more responsive to what happened to you last night. The police came in. It looks like they are doing what you asked them to do.
They are. UCLA is taking action. Police being on campus, immediately coming in, arresting students, that is what we need to see. On top of that, we need to see disciplinary action being taken. If a student goes and protests and advocates for terrorism, which is what they're doing, which obviously is against school code of conduct, they need to be disciplined. They need to be expelled. That is the only way they're going to learn.
What do you think? You think it's going to calm down, this anti-Semitism? Do you think it's in a lull? Do you think it's going to build back up? What's your take on what's going on across the country right now?
I think students are very naive, unfortunately, as you and I both know, and we need to show them that what they are doing is absolutely wrong. And if they can't learn the nice way, which is us telling them that what they're doing is wrong, they're going to have to learn the hard way, which is their, student visas being revoked if they are, not, if they're here on a student visa. Or the students that are Americans, they need to be disciplined. They need to be sent to jail if they're committing a crime.
So how does it help Americans to bring in these foreign students who support terror organizations like Hamas? I just don't see what it's in it for America. Kip asks, who is more intellectually honest, Grok or the New York Times? Well, I don't find intellectually honest a useful category because it only makes sense, including like the understanding the word freedom within a particular hero system. Right? Freedom means different things for different hero systems. What's intellectually honest means different things for people on the left or the right. So I wouldn't see Grok or the New York Times as more intellectually honest. They both have contributions and they both have blind spots and they have weaknesses and they have strengths just like you and me. Right? Different groups, different gifts, different weaknesses, different dangers. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.